ಬಗೆಗಿನ ಅಧ್ಯಯನದಲ್ಲಿ ಅವರು ಸಾಕಷ್ಟು ಪರಿಣಿತಿಯನ್ನು ಹೊಂದಿದ್ದಾರೆ. ಅವರ ಸಂಶೋಧನಾ ವಿಶೇಷತೆಗಳು ಮಧ್ಯಕಾಲೀನ ಮತ್ತು ವಸಾಹತುಶಾಹಿ ಭಾರತದಲ್ಲಿ ಧರ್ಮ ಮತ್ತು ರಾಜ್ಯ ರಚನೆಯನ್ನ ಕುರಿತಾಗಿತ್ತು. ಹಿಂದೂ ಧರ್ಮದ ಸಮಕಾಲೀನ ಅಂತಾರಾಷ್ಟ್ರೀಯ ಅಂಶಗಳಿಗೂ ಕೂಡ ಅದು ವ್ಯಾಪಿಸಿಕೊಂಡಿದೆ. ಅವರ ಪುಸ್ತಕ ಭಕ್ತಿ ಸಾರ್ವಭೌಮತ್ವ, ಡಿವೈನ್ ಅಂಡ್ ಕಿಂಗ್ಶಿಪ್ ಅಂಡ್ ರಿಲಿಜನ್ ಇನ್ ಇಂಡಿಯಾ ಅಂತಕ್ಕಂಥ ಕೃತಿಯನ್ನ ಸುಮಾರು 2 ತಿಂಗಳ ಹಿಂದೆ ಆಕ್ಸ್ಫರ್ಡ್ ಯೂನಿವರ್ಸಿಟಿಯು ಪಬ್ಲಿಷ್ ಮಾಡಿದೆ. ಇದು ಮೈಸೂರಿನ ಕೊನೆಯ ಅರಸೊತ್ತಿಗೆಯನ್ನ, ವಿಶೇಷವಾಗಿ 3ನೇ ದೇವರಾಜ ಒಡೆಯರ್ ಏನಿದ್ದಾನೆ ಅವನ ಹೊತ್ತಿಗೆನ ಅರಸೊತ್ತಿಗೆಯನ್ನ, ವಿಶೇಷವಾಗಿ ಆ ಕಾಲದ ಆರಂಭಿಕ ಆಧುನಿಕ ಕಾಲಘಟ್ಟದ ವಸಾಹತುಶಾಹಿ ನ್ಯಾಯಾಲಯ ಏನಿದೆ, ವಿಶೇಷವಾಗಿ ಅದರ ರಾಜತ್ವ, ಪ್ರದೇಶ ಮತ್ತು ಧರ್ಮದ ಪರಿಕಲ್ಪನೆಗಳನ್ನ ಮರುಪರಿಶೀಲಿಸುತ್ತದೆ. ವಿಶೇಷವಾಗಿ ಭಕ್ತಿಯ ಮೂಲಕ ಅದರ ಅಭಿವ್ಯಕ್ತಿಗಳು ಹೇಗಾದು ಮತ್ತು ಭಕ್ತಿ ಮತ್ತು ಧಾರ್ಮಿಕ ಸ್ವರೂಪದ ಇಮ್ಯಾಜರಿಗಳನ್ನ, ಪ್ರತೀಕಗಳನ್ನ ಹೇಗೆ ಮೈಸೂರಿನ ಪ್ರಭುತ್ವವು ಬಳಸಿಕೊಂಡು ತನ್ನ ಅಧಿಕಾರವನ್ನ ಅಥವಾ ಪ್ರಭುತ್ವವನ್ನ ಮಾನ್ಯಗೊಳಿಸಿಕೊಂಡಿತ್ತು ಅನ್ನುವಂತಹ ಒಂದು ವಿಶೇಷ ಪ್ರಶ್ನೆ ಮತ್ತು ಜಿಜ್ಞಾಸೆಯನ್ನ ತಮ್ಮ ಅಧ್ಯಯನಗಳಲ್ಲಿ ಇವರು ಈ ಕೃತಿಯಲ್ಲಿ ವಿಶೇಷವಾಗಿ ಮಂಡಿಸ್ತಾ ಬಂದಿದ್ದಾರೆ. ತಮ್ಮ 2ನೆಯ ಸಂಶೋಧನಾ ಕೃತಿ ಅದು ದ ಸಿಂಗಿಂಗ್ ದಿ ಗಾಡೆಸ್ ಇನ್ ಪ್ಲೇಸ್, ಫೋಕ್ ಸಾಂಗ್ಸ್, ಮಿತ್ ಅಂಡ್ ಸಿಚುವೇಟೆಡ್ ನಾಲೆಜ್ ಇನ್ ಮೈಸೂರು ಎಂಬುದಾಗಿ. ಇದು ಮೈಸೂರಿನ ಆರಾಧ್ಯ ದೈವ ಚಾಮುಂಡೇಶ್ವರಿ ಮತ್ತು ಆಕೆಯ ಪತಿದೇವನಾದ ನಂಜುಂಡೇಶ್ವರನ ಪುರಾಣಗಳನ್ನ ವಿಶೇಷವಾಗಿ ಇಂದಿಗೂ ಕೂಡ ಜನಸಾಮಾನ್ಯರು ಹಳೆ ಮೈಸೂರು ಭಾಗದಲ್ಲಿ ಕಥಿಸ್ತಕ್ಕಂತಹ ಸ್ಥಳೀಯ ಜನಪ್ರಿಯ ಸಂಪ್ರದಾಯಗಳನ್ನ ಇದು ಚಾರಿತ್ರಿಕವಾಗಿ ಪರಿಶೀಲನೆಗೊಳಿಸ್ತಕ್ಕಂಥ ಕೆಲಸವನ್ನ ಮಾಡಿದೆ. ಸುಮಾರು 2018ರಲ್ಲಿ ಸುನಿ ಪ್ರೆಸ್ ಮೂಲಕ ಮೌಮಿತಾ ಸೇನ್ ಮತ್ತು ಹಿಲರಿ ರೋಡ್ರಿಗಸ್ ಅಂತಕ್ಕಂಥ ಇನ್ನಿಬ್ರು ಸಂಶೋಧಕರೊಂದಿಗೆ ಅವರು ಸಂಪಾದಿಸಿದಂತಹ 9 ನೈಟ್ಸ್ ಆಫ್ ಗಾಡೆಸ್, ದಿ ನವರಾತ್ರಿ ಫೆಸ್ಟಿವಲ್ ಇನ್ ಸೌತ್ ಏಷ್ಯಾ ಕೃತಿಯು ನವರಾತ್ರಿ ಹಬ್ಬದ ವಿವಿಧ ರಾಜಕೀಯಾತ್ಮಕ ಮತ್ತು ಚಾರಿತ್ರಿಕ ಅಂಶಗಳನ್ನ ಅದು ಪರಿಶೀಲನೆ ಮಾಡುತ್ತೆ. ಭಾರತದಲ್ಲಿನ ಪರಿಸರ ಸಮಸ್ಯೆಗಳು ಮತ್ತು ಪವಿತ್ರ ಭೌಗೋಳಿಕತೆ, ಸೆಕ್ರೆಡ್ ಜಾಗ್ರಫಿ ಅಂತ ಏನಿದೆ, ಇದನ್ನ ಸೇರಿದಂತೆ ವ್ಯಾಪಕವಾದ ಸಮಕಾಲೀನ ವಿಷಯಗಳಿಗೆ ಸಂಬಂಧಿಸಿದಂತಹ ಪ್ರಕಟಣೆಗಳು, ಸಂಶೋಧನೆಗಳು ಮತ್ತು ನಿರಂತರವಾದ ಅಧ್ಯಯನದ ಆಸಕ್ತಿಗಳನ್ನ ಕ್ಯಾಲಬ್ ಸಿಮನ್ಸ್ ಅವರು ಹೊಂದಿದ್ದಾರೆ. ದಕ್ಷಿಣ ಏಷ್ಯಾದ ವಲಸೆ ಸಮುದಾಯಗಳು ಮತ್ತು ಜಾಗತೀಕರಣದ ಪರಿಣಾಮವಾಗಿ ಉದ್ಭವಿಸುವ ವಸ್ತು ಮತ್ತು ಜನಪ್ರಿಯ ಸಂಸ್ಕೃತಿಗಳು, ವಿಶೇಷವಾಗಿ ದಕ್ಷಿಣ ಏಷ್ಯಾದ ಧರ್ಮಗಳು, ಕಾಮಿಕ್ ಪುಸ್ತಕಗಳು ಮತ್ತು ಗ್ರಾಫಿಕ್ ಕಾದಂಬರಿಗಳಲ್ಲಿ ಚಿತ್ರಿಸಲಾಗಿರತಕ್ಕಂತಹ ಕಥನಗಳ ಕುರಿತು ಕೂಡ ಅವರು ತೀವ್ರತರನಾದ ಅಧ್ಯಯನದ ಆಸಕ್ತಿಯನ್ನು ಹೊಂದಿದ್ದಾರೆ. ಸದ್ಯ ಅಮೆರಿಕಾದ ಅರಿಜೋನಾ ಯೂನಿವರ್ಸಿಟಿಯ ಧಾರ್ಮಿಕ ಅಧ್ಯಯನ ಕೇಂದ್ರದಲ್ಲಿ ಹಿಂದೂ ಧರ್ಮ, ಯೋಗ, ದೇವತೆಗಳು ಮತ್ತು ರಾಕ್ಷಸರು, ದಕ್ಷಿಣ ಏಷ್ಯಾದಲ್ಲಿ ದೈವತ್ವ ಮತ್ತು ಭಾರತೀಯ ಧರ್ಮಗಳು ಹಾಗೂ ಧಾರ್ಮಿಕ ಅಧ್ಯಯನ ವಿಧಾನ ಮತ್ತು ಸಿದ್ಧಾಂತದ ಶಿಕ್ಷಣವನ್ನ ಇವರು ಕಲಿಸ್ತಾ ಇದ್ದಾರೆ. ಇವರ ವಿಶೇಷವಾದ ಆಸಕ್ತಿ ನಾನು ಈಗಾಗಲೇ ಹೇಳಿದ ಹಾಗೆ ಹಿಂದೂ ಧರ್ಮ ಮತ್ತು ದಕ್ಷಿಣ ಏಷ್ಯಾದ ಧರ್ಮಗಳು. ಇವರಿಗೆ ಸಂದಿರ್ತಕ್ಕಂಥ ಪ್ರಶಸ್ತಿಗಳನ್ನು ಕೂಡ ನಾನು ಈ ಸಮಯದಲ್ಲಿ ಉಲ್ಲೇಖ ಮಾಡಬೇಕು. 2020ರಲ್ಲಿ ಅರಿಜೋನಾ ಯೂನಿವರ್ಸಿಟಿ ಕೊಡಮಾಡತಕ್ಕಂತಹ ಪ್ರತಿಷ್ಠಿತ ಪ್ರಶಸ್ತಿ ಅರ್ಲಿ ಕೆರಿಯರ್ ಸ್ಕಾಲರ್ಸ್ ಅವಾರ್ಡ್ ಅನ್ನ ಕ್ಯಾಲಬ್ ಸಿಮನ್ಸ್ ಅವರು ಪಡೆದಿದ್ದಾರೆ. 2016 ಮತ್ತು 2017ರಲ್ಲಿ ಜರ್ಮನಿಯ ಒಂದು ಶ್ರೇಷ್ಠ ಯೂನಿವರ್ಸಿಟಿ ಅಲ್ಲಿಯ ರುಹ್ ಎನ್ನುವ ಪ್ರದೇಶದಲ್ಲಿರ್ತಕ್ಕಂಥ ಯೂನಿವರ್ಸಿಟಿ ಬೊಕಮ್ ನಲ್ಲಿರುವ ಕೇಟ್ ಹಾಂಬರ್ಗರ್ ಕಾಲೇಜ್ ನಲ್ಲಿ ವಿಸಿಟಿಂಗ್ ರಿಸರ್ಚ್ ಫೆಲೋ ಆಗಿ ಕೂಡ ಅವರು ಸೇವೆಯನ್ನು ಸಲ್ಲಿಸಿದ್ದಾರೆ. ಅವರ ಆಯ್ದ ಮುಖ್ಯ ಪ್ರಕಟಣೆಗಳು ಹೀಗಿವೆ. ನಾನು ಈಗಾಗಲೇ ಹೇಳಿದಾಗೆ ಡಿವೋಷನಲ್ ಸಾವರ್ನಿಟಿ ಮತ್ತು 9 ನೈಟ್ಸ್ ಆಫ್ ಗಾಡೆಸ್. ಅದಲ್ಲದೆ ಇರ್ತಕ್ಕಂಥ ಅವರ ಪ್ರಮುಖವಾದ ಪ್ರಬಂಧಗಳು ಹೀಗಿದೆ: ಸಬ್ವರ್ಸಿವ್ ಸ್ಪೇಸ್, ರೆಪ್ರೆಸೆಂಟೇಷನ್ಸ್ ಆಫ್ ಸ್ಪೇಸ್ ಆಸ್ ಆರ್ಟಿಕ್ಯುಲೇಷನ್ಸ್ ಆಫ್ ಸಾವರ್ನಿಟಿ ಇನ್ ಕಲೋನಿಯಲ್ ಮೈಸೂರು. ಇದು ರಿಲಿಜನ್ ನ ವಾಲ್ಯೂಮ್ 50ರಲ್ಲಿ ಪಬ್ಲಿಷ್ ಆಗಿದೆ. ಹಿಸ್ಟ್ರಿ, ಹೆರಿಟೇಜ್ ಅಂಡ್ ಮಿತ್, ಲೋಕಲ್ ಹಿಸ್ಟೋರಿಕಲ್ ಇಮ್ಯಾಜಿನೇಷನ್ ಇನ್ ದ ಫೈಟ್ ಟು ಪ್ರಿಸರ್ವ್ ಚಾಮುಂಡಿ ಹಿಲ್ ಇನ್ ವರ್ಲ್ಡ್ ವ್ಯೂಸ್, ಗ್ಲೋಬಲ್ ರಿಲಿಜನ್ಸ್, ಕಲ್ಚರ್ಸ್, ಇಕಾಲಜಿ ವಾಲ್ಯೂಮ್ ನ 22ನೇ ವಾಲ್ಯೂಮ್ ನಲ್ಲಿ ಇದು ಪಬ್ಲಿಷ್ ಆಗಿದೆ. Genealogy and Political Change in Imperial Mysore 1645 to 1705 circa in Peninsular Musings. ಅದು ಕೊಟ್ಟಾಯಂನ ನ್ಯಾಷನಲ್ ಬುಕ್ ಸ್ಟಾಲ್, ವಿಶೇಷವಾಗಿ ಸಾಹಿತ್ಯ ಪ್ರವರ್ತಕ ಸಹಕರಣ ಸಂಘಂ ಪಬ್ಲಿಷ್ ಮಾಡಿದ ಕೃತಿಲಿ ಅದು ಪಬ್ಲಿಷ್ ಆಗಿದೆ. ಅವರ ಇನ್ನೊಂದು ಇಂಪಾರ್ಟೆಂಟ್ ಆದ ಬರಹ, ವೆರಿ ಇಂಪಾರ್ಟೆಂಟ್ ಆದ ಬರಹ, ಫ್ಯಾಮಿಲಿ ಗಾಡ್ ಅಂಡ್ ಕಿಂಗ್, ವಂಶಾವಳಿ ಆಸ್ ರಾಯಲಿಸ್ಟ್ ಲಿಟ್ರೇಚರ್ ಅಂತಕ್ಕಂಥ ಮಹಾಪ್ರಬಂಧ, ಒಂದು ಸಂಶೋಧನಾ ಪ್ರಬಂಧ. ಕ್ಲಿಯೋ ಅಂಡ್ ಹರ್ ಡಿಸೆಂಡೆಂಟ್ಸ್ ಅಂತಕ್ಕಂತಹ ದಕ್ಷಿಣ ಭಾರತದ ಪ್ರಸಿದ್ಧ ಚರಿತ್ರಕಾರ ಕೇಶವನ್ ವೆಲುತ್ತಾಟ್ ಅವರ ಗೌರವಾರ್ಥವಾಗಿ ತಂದಿರತಕ್ಕಂತಹ ಗೌರವ ಪ್ರಬಂಧ. ಮನು ದೇವದೇವನ್ ಅವರು ಅದನ್ನ ಎಡಿಟ್ ಮಾಡಿದ್ದಾರೆ. ನ್ಯೂ ಡೆಲ್ಲಿಯ ಪ್ರೈಮಸ್ ಬುಕ್ 2018ರಲ್ಲಿ ಅದನ್ನ ಪಬ್ಲಿಷ್ ಮಾಡಿದೆ. ಆ ಸಂಶೋಧನಾ ಗ್ರಂಥದಲ್ಲಿ, ಆ ಗೌರವ ಪ್ರಬಂಧದ ಕೃತಿಯಲ್ಲಿ ಇದು ಫ್ಯಾಮಿಲಿ ಗಾಡ್ ಅಂಡ್ ಕಿಂಗ್, ವಂಶಾವಳಿ ಆಸ್ ರಾಯಲಿಸ್ಟ್ ಲಿಟ್ರೇಚರ್ ಪಬ್ಲಿಷ್ ಆಗಿದೆ. ಸೊ ಇದನ್ನ ಬಿಟ್ಟು ಅವರ ಅನೇಕ ಬರಹ ಇದೆ. ಅದನ್ನ ಹೇಳ್ತಾ ಹೋದ್ರೆ ತುಂಬಾ ದೊಡ್ಡ ಪಟ್ಟಿ ಆಗುತ್ತೆ. ಅದನ್ನ ನಾನು ಬೇರೆ ಬೇರೆ ಸಂದರ್ಭದಲ್ಲಿ ಹಂಚ್ಕೋತೀವಿ. ಬಹುಶಃ ಇನ್ನು 2 ಪ್ರಕಟಣೆಗಳನ್ನು ಹೇಳಬೇಕು. ದ ಕಿಂಗ್ ಅಂಡ್ ಯದು ಲೈನ್, ಇದು ಕೂಡ ಮೈಸೂರಿನ ಕುರಿತಾದದ್ದು. ಪರ್ಫಾರ್ಮಿಂಗ್ ಲೀನೇಜ್ ಥ್ರೂ ದಸರಾ ಇನ್ 19th century ಮೈಸೂರು. ಅದು 9 Nights of Goddess ಕೃತಿನಲ್ಲಿ ಪಬ್ಲಿಷ್ ಆಗಿದೆ. ಇದಲ್ಲದೆ ಬಹುಶಃ ಇವರ ದೇವತೆ, ವೈಷ್ಣವ ಧರ್ಮ ಮತ್ತು ಪ್ರಾದೇಶಿಕ ಒಡೆತನ, ಮೈಸೂರು ಒಡೆಯರ ಭಕ್ತಿ ಪರಂಪರೆಯ ಸ್ವರೂಪ, ರಾಜ ಒಡೆಯರ್ ಕಾಲದಲ್ಲಿ ಆದಂತಹ ಬದಲಾವಣೆ ಅಂತಕ್ಕಂತಹ ಒಂದು ಇಂಪಾರ್ಟೆಂಟ್ ಆದ ಪ್ರಬಂಧ. ಕರ್ನಾಟಕದ ಒಂದು ಬಹುಮುಖ್ಯವಾದ ಇತಿಹಾಸದ ಜರ್ನಲ್ ಆಗಿರತಕ್ಕಂತಹ ನಮ್ಮ ಇತಿಹಾಸ ದರ್ಪಣದ 2016ರ ಚಳಿಗಾಲದ ಆವೃತ್ತಿಯಲ್ಲಿ ಅದು ಪಬ್ಲಿಷ್ ಆಗಿದೆ. ಬಹುಶಃ ಇದಲ್ಲದೆ ನಾನು ಕೊನೆಗೆ ಹೇಳಿದೆ, ಗ್ರಾಫಿಕ್ ರೂಪದಲ್ಲಿ ದೇವತೆಯರನ್ನು ಚಿತ್ರಣೆ ಮಾಡತಕ್ಕಂಥ ಒಂದು ಪಾಪ್ಯುಲರ್ ಕಲ್ಚರ್ ಇವರ ಆಸಕ್ತಿ ಕ್ಷೇತ್ರ ಅಂತ ಹೇಳಿದೆ. ದ ಗ್ರಾಫಿಕ್ ಗಾಡೆಸ್ ಇನ್ ಮಾಡರ್ನ್ ಆರ್ಟ್ ಏಷ್ಯಾ ಅಂತಕ್ಕಂಥ ಒಂದು ಇಂಪಾರ್ಟೆಂಟ್ ಆದ ಇವರ ಪತ್ರಿಕೆ ಲಂಡನ್ನ ಎನ್ಜೋ ಆರ್ಟ್ಸ್ ಪಬ್ಲಿಷಿಂಗ್ 2012ರಲ್ಲಿ ಅದು ಒಂದು ಇವರ ಪ್ರಬಂಧವನ್ನ ಅದರ ಕುರಿತು ಪಬ್ಲಿಷ್ ಮಾಡಿದೆ. ಇದಲ್ಲದೆ ಕೊನೆಯದಾಗಿ ನಾನೇನ್ ಹೇಳ್ಬೇಕಂದ್ರೆ, ನೀನಾ ಪಾಲೆ ಅಂತಕ್ಕಂಥ ಒಬ್ರು ಇಂಪಾರ್ಟೆಂಟ್ ಆದ ಫಿಲ್ಮ್ ಮೇಕರ್, ಅವರ ಅನಿಮೇಷನ್ ಫಿಲ್ಮ್ ಮೇಕರ್, ಅವರ ಸೀತಾ ಸಿಂಗ್ಸ್ ದ ಬ್ಲೂಸ್ ಅಂತಕ್ಕಂತಹ ಒಂದು ಸಿನಿಮಾ ಮತ್ತು ಒಂದು ಪ್ರಬಂಧ, ಒಂದು ಸಂಕಲಿತ ಪುಸ್ತಕ, ಅದರಲ್ಲಿ ಎಸ್ ಸರ್ ದಟ್ಸ್ ಮೈ ದೇವಿ, ಅಥಾರಿಟಿ ಅಂಡ್ ದ ಗಾಡೆಸ್ ಅಂತಕ್ಕಂಥ ಒಂದು ಪ್ರಬಂಧವನ್ನು ಕೂಡ ತುಂಬಾ ಪರಿಣಾಮಕಾರಿಯಾಗಿ ಮತ್ತು ಜಿಜ್ಞಾಸೆಯ ಪ್ರಶ್ನೆಗಳನ್ನ ಇಟ್ಟುಕೊಂಡು ಪಬ್ಲಿಷ್ ಮಾಡಿದ್ದಾರೆ. ಇಂತಹ ಮೈಸೂರಿನ, ವಿಶೇಷವಾಗಿ ಮೈಸೂರಿನ 18ನೇ ಶತಮಾನದ ಮೈಸೂರಿನ ಪ್ರಭುತ್ವವನ್ನ ಮತ್ತು ಮೈಸೂರಿನ ದೇವರಾದ ಮಹಿಷಾಸುರ ಮತ್ತು ಬೇರೆ ಬೇರೆ ದೇವರುಗಳ ನಡುವೆ ಇರತಕ್ಕಂಥ ಸಂಬಂಧದ ಒಂದು ಸಂಗತಿಯನ್ನ, ಒಂದು ಕಾರ್ಯಕಾರಣವನ್ನ ಚಾರಿತ್ರಿಕವಾದ ಅಧ್ಯಯನಕ್ಕೆ ಒಳಪಡಿಸಿ ಮೈಸೂರಿನ ಸ್ಪೆಷಲಿಸ್ಟ್ ಅಂತಕ್ಕಂಥ ಸ್ವರೂಪದಲ್ಲಿ ನಮ್ಮ ಮುಂದಿದ್ದಾರೆ ಕ್ಯಾಲಬ್ ಸಿಮನ್ಸ್ ಅವರು. ಇತಿಹಾಸ ದರ್ಪಣದ ಪರವಾಗಿ, ಬೆಂಗಳೂರು ಹಿಸ್ಟೋರಿಯನ್ ಸೊಸೈಟಿ ಪರವಾಗಿ, ಋತುಮಾನದ ಪರವಾಗಿ ನಾನು ಅವರನ್ನ ಸ್ವಾಗತಿಸ್ತಾ ಇದ್ದೇನೆ. ಮತ್ತು ಎಲ್ಲರನ್ನು ಕೂಡ, ಈ ಕಾರ್ಯಕ್ರಮಕ್ಕೆ ನೆರೆದಿರತಕ್ಕಂಥ ಎಲ್ಲರನ್ನು ಕೂಡ ನಾನು ಸ್ವಾಗತಿಸ್ತಾ ಇದ್ದೇನೆ. 2-3 ಸಣ್ಣ ಸೂಚನೆ. ಈ ಸೆಷನ್ ಇರುತ್ತೆ. ಕ್ಯಾಲಬ್ ಸಿಮನ್ಸ್, ನಿಮ್ಗೆ ಸ್ವಾಗತ. ಹಾರ್ಟ್ಲಿ ವೆಲ್ಕಮ್ ಫಾರ್ ಕ್ಯಾಲಬ್ ಸಿಮನ್ಸ್.
ಧನ್ಯವಾದಗಳು. ಥ್ಯಾಂಕ್ ಯು.
ಈ ಸೆಷನ್ ಇಂಗ್ಲಿಷ್ ಮತ್ತು ಕನ್ನಡ 2 ಭಾಷೆಯಲ್ಲಿ ಇರುತ್ತೆ. 1 ಗಂಟೆ 15 ನಿಮಿಷ ಸೆಷನ್ ಇರುತ್ತೆ. 1 ಗಂಟೆ 15 ನಿಮಿಷದ ನಂತರ ಈ ಸೆಷನ್ 20-25 ನಿಮಿಷಗಳ ಕಾಲ, ಇನ್ನೂ ಹೆಚ್ಚಂದ್ರೆ 30 ನಿಮಿಷಗಳ ಕಾಲ ಗರಿಷ್ಠ ಅವಧಿಗೆ ಚರ್ಚೆಗಾಗಿ ತೆರೆಕೊಳ್ಳುತ್ತೆ. ಎಲ್ಲರ ಪ್ರಶ್ನೆಗಳಿಗೂ ಕೂಡ ಸ್ವಾಗತ. ಯಾವುದೇ ರೀತಿಯ ಪ್ರಶ್ನೆಗಳಿದ್ರು ಕೂಡ ಸ್ವಾಗತ. ಕೊನೆಯಲ್ಲಿ ಅಂತ ಪ್ರಶ್ನೆಗಳನ್ನ ನಾವು ಎತ್ಕೋತೀವಿ. ಧನ್ಯವಾದ. ಈಗ ಕ್ಯಾಲಬ್ ಸಿಮನ್ಸ್ ಅವರು ತಮ್ಮ ಮಂಡನೆಯನ್ನ ಮಾಡ್ಬೇಕಂತೇಳಿ ಕೇಳ್ತಾ ಇದ್ದೀನಿ. ನಮಸ್ಕಾರ ಕ್ಯಾಲಬ್ ಸಿಮನ್ಸ್. ಸ್ವಾಗತ ಕ್ಯಾಲಬ್ ಸಿಮನ್ಸ್ ಅವರು.
ನಮಸ್ಕಾರ, ಧನ್ಯವಾದಗಳು. ನನ್ಗೆ ತುಂಬಾ ಖುಷಿ ಆಯ್ತು. ಮತ್ತು ಅಮೆರಿಕದಲ್ಲಿ ಕನ್ನಡ ಭಾಷೆ ಅಭ್ಯಾಸ ಮಾಡಲ್ಲ. ಸೊ ಈಗ ಇಂಗ್ಲಿಷ್ ಭಾಷೆಯಲ್ಲಿ ಲೆಕ್ಚರ್ ಮಾಡ್ತೀನಿ. Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Pradeep. Thank you, Itihasa Darpana, everyone who's sponsored this, Bengaluru Historian Society. I'm very happy to be here and to talk to you. Sorry a little bit about the glare on the monitor behind me. I tested it about an hour ago, and then the sun rose, so we get a little extra light that causes a glare. But again, I thank you for having me. And with that, I'll start. And I'm just going to, instead of speaking extemporaneously, I've prepared a talk to keep it a little more tight and not go over time. So I'll just begin. In September of 2013, 2 weeks before the commencement of the 10-day celebration of Dasara, I was granted an audience with the now late Maharaja of Mysore, Sri Kantadatta Narasimharaja Wodeyar, who you can see on the screen behind me. Since I had been working with his staff in the Mysore Palace archives, he was eager to hear about my project, and I was equally, if not more excited, to share my work with the scion of the Wodeyar family, the royal family whose history has consumed so much of my time and thoughts for the past decade. The Maharaja was widely considered a man of learning, of progressive thought, so I presented him several articles I had written, even those in which I questioned his family's descent and the origin of their family tutelary deity Chamundeshwari. The Maharaja proceeded to read the articles in front of me, giving me line-by-line critiques, mixed with his personal opinions about my project. At one point, however, he became noticeably disturbed by an article in which I stated that Chamundeshwari had been reinvented from a local guardian deity to the Puranic slayer of the buffalo demon in the 17th century. The Maharaja unleashed a voracious monologue on both the nature of his lineage and their deity Chamundeshwari. He chided me about my assumption that the goddess could undergo what I called transformation, and he said, quote, "She is Adi Shakti, the primordial goddess. How can she be reinvented? She is forever the same." Then he proceeded to continue to correct my understanding of the goddess for the rest of our 3.5-hour meeting. He concluded by suggesting that I stop looking at local, and by this he meant the Kannada language sources that I was looking at, and remarked that if I really wanted to understand the relationship between the goddess and the kings of India, that I should read the Annals and Antiquities of Rajasthan, a 19th century book about the history of the kings of Rajasthan. Of course, you all know that's about 1,500 kilometers away, and it was written not by an Indian, but by James Todd, an administrator in the East India Company. While his reaction to the material was not that surprising, his response caught me completely off guard. I had expected the Maharaja to embrace my use of Kannada and Sanskrit sources, especially since Kannada is the language of was the language of the Mysore court, and of course his mother tongue. Instead, he suggested that I read a British account of the goddess and Indian kingship that describes practices very far away from his family's domain. Upon reflection, however, the late Maharaja's response should not have been that surprising. Instead, his rejoinder demonstrated the effectiveness of the recreation of the Wodeyar line during the early colonial period during the reign of Mummadi Krishnaraja Wodeyar, who ruled from 1799 to 1868. This period, during which the Mysore king lost all administrative and military power, gave rise to a full-scale re-articulation of kingship, through which the Wodeyars laid claim to pan-Indic spiritual power, made possible through the expansion of their devotional landscape, in which their goddess Chamundeshwari occupied the central position. This subtle subversion of British authority was completely illegible to the colonial administration, and after the death of Mummadi Krishnaraja, the pan-Indic royal program, minus the emphasis on transcendent power, of course, even became part of Britain's rewriting of Indian history and religion in books such as the one recommended by the Maharaja and written by James Todd. So it is imperative that we consider the understudied local Kannada sources from Mummadi Krishnaraja's rule in order to understand the novel ways that the court fashioned the Wodeyar rulers in contradistinction to the British notions of power and state through devotional practices in Mysore, devotional practices, because they were central in shaping the contemporary belief and practice in Mysore and our overall understanding of Hinduism as a pan-Indic religion. So let's go back to the critical period in the 19th century. Mummadi Krishnaraja was crowned the king of Mysore by the emergent British East India Company in 1799, restoring the Wodeyar line to the throne after the fall of Sri Rangapatna and the Muslim ruler Tipu Sultan, and through the ratification of the Mysore Subsidiary Treaty. Since the inception of the kingdom in the 17th century, Mysore had been regarded by their South Indian neighbors and their European counterparts as a vicious martial state, and were infamous for hacking off the noses of their enemies, women and children included. And we find a lot of this in the archives of the East India Company when they write about this practice. Likewise, their tutelary goddess Chamundi was better known throughout India as an emaciated goddess of the battlefield and cremation grounds, who craved blood sacrifice and was heralded for slaying the buffalo demon. However, as part of the subsidiary treaty, Mysore was forced to tear down many of its forts and disband much of their standing army. Most contemporary scholarly depictions of this period portray it as a time when the king supposedly retired to a life of luxury within his palace, bereft of any power other than cultural clout. I suggest that this was not the case. Rather, the court of Mysore sought to shift the locus of power from the mundane realm to power that was located in the transcendent realm, subverting the British Empire by crowning the Wodeyars rulers of a pan-Indian, incorporeal empire of devotion. The court of Krishnaraja III, or Muhammadi Krishnaraja, began a process of refashioning the kings of Mysore as rulers of a transcendent and devotional realm, and the goddess as the mother of the universe, thereby bypassing any British claims to authority by shifting the very nature of true ruling power from militaristic to religious. This moment of active self-fashioning on the part of the Wodeyar court was thoroughly enacted in a variety of cultural media. In this presentation, I will discuss two such courtly productions, one, Vamshavali, or lineage text, and the other, temple mural paintings, that were critical in the attempt to form a pan-Indian devotional empire in Mysore. In the first half of my presentation, I will show how the lineage text incorporated a variety of deities and a broad yet specific geographical frame within the lineage history, connecting the Wodeyar kings to sacred sites throughout India. Then, in the second half, I will show how the same process of pan-Indianization was enacted through visual rhetoric in the murals of one Mysore temple, namely the Venkateramana Swami temple in Mysore that's right next to the Jagan Mohan Palace. As we will see, both the discursive and visual spheres of artistic productions sought to broaden the scope of Wodeyar devotion to include all important South Indian devotional traditions and sacred sites, and to link those with well-known sites in the north. By doing this, the court of Muhammadi Krishnaraja centered his kingdom and his lineage at the heart of a pan-Indian devotional landscape, and their tutelary deity, Chamundi, as the center of this devotional framework. At the time, this was a truly novel configuration of devotional traditions, one that now, with our assumptions about Hinduism, seems completely natural. So let us first turn to the literary material. Vamshavali, or genealogical literature from the Wodeyar court, is one part historiography and one part Purana. By that, I mean the texts are meticulous in using precise dates, not only for births and deaths of kings, but offering dates and places for major events and battles throughout. However, they also cast the entire history of their clan within a Puranic framework in which gods and goddesses manifest within the world in order to interact and guide the Wodeyar kings. The composition is even Puranic in nature, as the texts build upon older narratives, inserting new tales and stacking devotional elements upon one another in order to produce a new narrative thrust. Additionally, the Mysore Vamshavali text operates similarly to the Puranic narratives by couching contemporaneous debates within the events of a divine past, giving their outcome both divine and temporal authenticity. By looking at the additions and revisions from one text to the next, we can see the active self-fashioning that is taking place during this period. The primary royal history of the Wodeyar kingdom, as you can see here in its printed form behind me, is the Mysuru Samsthanada Prabhugalu Sriman Maharaja Vamshavali, which in its printed form had the English subtitle, The Annals. The Kannada text was subsequently printed with the English title, The Annals of the Mysore Royal Family. So hereafter, I'll simply just refer to the text as The Annals. The Annals is said to have been originally composed by Muhammadi Krishnaraja himself. It relates the life and the deeds of the first 21 rulers of Mysore and the birth of the 22nd Mummadi Krishnaraja. But for the sake of this talk, my primary focus will be on the second chapter that provides the story of the legendary founder Yaduraya's establishment of the Wodeyar kingdom in Mysore. Within this text, many of the genealogical details that had been inserted into the dynasty's medieval literature and/or inscriptions were reiterated. The Annals develops all of them to a new height in order to focus on the lineage's devotional history, and it also introduces many new devotional elements in which the founders of the lineage interact with various deities and are connected to a variety of sacred sites throughout India that demonstrate the pan-Indic expansion of Mysore's devotional program. At this point, it might be helpful for me to summarize the main points of the origin narrative from the text. In his sleep, Yaduraya received a vision from Vishnu telling him to go to the Vindhya mountains. After arriving there, he and his brother Krishnaraja performed puja to the goddess Vindhyavasini, who lives in these mountains. She was pleased by their worship and appeared before them, telling them to go to Mysore, where she eternally lives as Chamundeshwari Adi Shakti, the mother of the universe, and worship her again. She promised that if they followed her instructions, they would gain a kingdom. So the brothers left and went through Vijayanagara, the major South Indian empire from which Mysore gained its independence, to Melkote, where they worshiped the deity Chalavadnarayana Swami, an extremely important South Indian form of Vishnu, before proceeding to Chamundi Hill in Mysore. After worshiping the goddess upon the hill, they then went to Nanjangudi and worshipped Shiva's form there. That night, when sleeping and meditating at the goddess's feet, Chamundeshwari came once again in the form of a small girl. She told them to go into Mysore's Trineshwara temple and to wait for a priest from the locally influential Virashaiva caste who would help them win their kingdom. That next morning, Shiva came to them in the form of a Virashaya Jangama, or preceptor, who told them that the kingdom of Mysore had been overtaken by an evil minister, and only they, because of their divine/royal descent from the Yadu Vamsha, were worthy to win it back. Then he said another Virashaya Jangama would come and show them how to defeat the minister, and then he vanished. After this miraculous feat, the brothers realized that the holy man had been none other than Shiva incarnate, and decided to adopt him and their family as their family deity alongside Chamundeshwari. The text goes on to relate the arrival of the second Virashaiva Jangama, the brothers' victory over the evil minister, Yaduraya's marriage to the princess, and subsequent coronation as the king of Mysore. However, it behooves us to halt here and discuss the range of devotional practices and alliances narrated in this passage to highlight the novel devotional inclusivity expressed in this new origin story. In this passage, the text strategically connects the Wodeyar rulers to the goddess, Vaishnavism, Shaivism, and Virashaivism, and its devotion and sacred sites, and places the founding of the kingdom as the prerogative of the divine. As such, the kingdom of Mysore was not based in its former military might, but was formed through their fervent devotion to the gods and goddess. In this passage, the central devotional figure is the goddess Chamundeshwari. She is heralded as the original family deity, and it is through the brothers' propitiation and worship of her that the kingdom of Mysore, quote, falls into their hands. This portion of the text closely resembles what I've described in my book and in my dissertation as the historical trajectory of the Wodeyar devotion, in which the local goddess is propitiated by local rulers for military victories as they sought to expand their territory and regional influence that is reflected in the earliest inscriptions from the Wodeyar line. Goddess devotion, however, had been a persistent theme throughout the literature of the medieval Wodeyar court, but references were always brief allusions to kings and rulers who had won the favor of the goddess or were born from a boon granted by her. However, this text goes beyond the short narrative of local significance and beyond the mere allusion to Chamundeshwari as the Puranic slayer of the buffalo demon. Instead, the text connects Chamundi to the goddess of the Vindhya mountains, Vindhyavasini. The annals suggest that both goddesses, here you could say it's with a lowercase g, in Kannada they're sort of referred to as devates, and both of these goddesses, we find out, are manifestations of the goddess, or Mahadevi, and she's only just known by different names in the two different abodes. By connecting the Mysore goddess to the well-known goddess from the Vindhya mountains in central India, the author of the text is clearly attempting to link the local goddess of Mysore to the pan-Indic tradition, not simply through references to Puranic narratives, but through connections with specific and important deities within the subcontinent. The texts are clear, however, that these goddesses are not equal manifestations, but Chamundeshwari in Mysore is indeed Adi Shakti, the primordial goddess and the mother of the universe, a distinction that was first given to her in inscriptions during the reign of Mummadi Krishnaraja. No longer is she the terrifying goddess of the hill that receives human sacrifice, or delights in the carnage of the battlefield, but she is the mother who visits her children and provides safety and security for her Wodeyar kings. Through this depiction, the text is altering the nature of goddess devotion in the region, simultaneously expanding its scope and centering pan-Indian goddess devotion within the Mysore kingdom and its capital. That's them traveling through Vijayanagara. This is the brothers meeting with Shiva in his form as a Jangama. Then here, for anyone who's not familiar, this is the Utsava Murti of Chamundeshwari up on Chamundi Hill. Okay. While the mother goddess Chamundeshwari was the pinnacle of Wodeyar devotional fervor, the narrative of the annals opens itself and the Wodeyar kings to the entire devotional landscape of southern Karnataka, connecting them and the goddess with Shaiva devotion for the first time in their courtly literature. In the story, immediately after performing puja to Chamundeshwari, the brothers Wodeyar traveled to Nanjanguddu, which we can see here in this slide, popularly known in the region as the southern Kailasa, Shiva's abode, to offer worship to the blue-throated Lord Shiva. There they spend the night, during which Yadaraya received the vision from Chamundeshwari, telling him to go to the Trineshwara Shaiva temple in Mysore, where he was visited by a priest who turned out to be none other than Shiva himself. Here we clearly see the Shaiva devotional patterns, which were centered around Nanjandeshwara temple in Nanjanguddu, and they had been fully incorporated into the devotional program of Krishnaraja Wodeyar III, or Mummadi Krishnaraja's court, a devotional tradition first introduced into the Wodeyar courtly productions during the 20-year period in the 18th century when Mysore had been ruled by the Kalale, a subsidiary family from nearby Nanjanguddu. The promotion of Shaiva devotion can be seen in the connection between Chamundeshwari and Nanjandeshwara as the divine couple Shiva-Parvati. The reference within the text is vague, and translated into English it says, quote, "If we complete the task that the goddess has commanded, then just like the goddess Sri Chamundeshwari is our family goddess, Nanjandeshwara will become our family god." But this seems to capture the local folk devotional tradition that was developing simultaneously, in which Nanjandeshwara and Chamundeshwari were wedded, but placing it within a Sanskritic and Pan-Indic context instead of the local folk narrative. Of course, this folk narrative is what my current book project is on. So if people are interested during the question period, I would love to talk more about the folk songs and how these align with the royal story. But now, for the sake of time, I'll just move on. In addition to the goddess and Shaiva, or the Shakti and Shaiva materials, the narrative leaves a place for Vaishnava devotion. The Puranic narrative of the birth of the cosmos from Vishnu's navel is alluded to in the very first scene of the annals. The brothers are also connected to the line of Vishnu's incarnation as Krishna and are said to have hailed from his former kingdom in Dwaraka. Even the initial dream that told the Wodeyar brothers to leave their native place was a dream in which Vishnu gave the command. And lastly, they traveled through the traditional Vaishnava devotional center of Melakote, which we can see here on the slide, and worship many gods, including Chelava Narayana Swami, an extremely important Vaishnava temple in southern Karnataka. Of course, it's important for Sri Ramanuja and also for Sri Vaishnavism. This comes as no surprise, as Vaishnavism was the most prominent mode of kingly devotional rhetoric found in the Wodeyar court productions since the rise of the clan in 1610, when they converted to Sri Vaishnavism. However, the Vaishnava rhetoric in the annals has been toned down compared to their medieval narratives. In previous Wodeyar literature, their kings had been proclaimed to be the incarnations of Vishnu on earth. But in the annals, the only allusion to the Mysore king as an incarnation of Vishnu is a vague reference where the Wodeyar king, who first converted to Sri Vaishnavism, that's Raja Wodeyar, is said to have become one with the Vaishnava image in Melakote. But the text explains that this was in order to show that there was no difference between the gods Vishnu and Shiva, again signaling that the goal was actually to provide an inclusive devotional program, moving away from rigid sectarian boundaries. So here we see, again, the Shiva in the form of a Jangava meeting with the brothers, Yaduraya and Krishnaraja, when they're about to start their empire. The only remaining devotional element to be discussed, that's the inclusion of the Jangama, the Virashaiva preceptor. This is striking in its novelty. Devotional alliances with priests and religious institutions that bestowed spiritual or martial power to aspiring kings had been crucial in the origin stories of all the major dynasties in southern Karnataka in the medieval period. However, here for the first time, the alliance is explicitly made with a Virashaiva Jangama, who directs the brothers to kill their enemies either by strength or deceit. Virashaivas had a tenuous relationship with the Wodeyars after they took part in a rebellion in the 17th century. Thereafter, they had never fully been incorporated into the devotional fold, as had Shaiva Smarta or Sri Vaishnava or even Shakta goddess traditions. All those that we've discussed so far. Perhaps the turning point regarding the Virashaivas and the Wodeyar devotional program came during the reign of Mummadi Krishnaraja after the events of the Nagara rebellion in 1831, a rebellion of the Virashaivas in the northern Mysore territory that also is the same rebellion that resulted in the British seizure of Mysore administration. The origin story in the annals, which was written nearly 30 years after the rebellion and its subsequent British takeover, can be viewed as a post hoc attempt to make a place for the Virashaiva community within the devotional world of Mummadi Krishnaraja's transcendent kingdom. We even see later in the origin story that in order to solidify their bond to the Virashaiva community, the Jangama orders Yaduraya to change his family name to Wodeyar at his coronation. This small reference is easy to overlook, but it is crucial for a reinterpretation of the Wodeyars and their connection to the Virashaiva community. The term Wodeyar, which is anglicized, or Odir, had been a title employed within medieval Vijayanagara administration for a small regional chieftain, and which was given to the rulers of Mysore by the Vijayanagara viceroy in 1572. The Wodeyar clan certainly developed their family name from this petty administrative position within Vijayanagara polity as a way to maintain a royal authority as the empire crumbled. Simultaneously, however, the term had also become the title for a Virashaiva priest. The alternative etymological history provided firmly places the establishment of the dynasty in relationship to the Virashaiva community, making them the foremost amongst the dynasty's religious leaders. And when we consider all the complexity of the devotional plurality of the annals, it seems prudent to view these new narrative additions as just that, something completely new and different, in which the very ontology of the Mysore kingdom and the kingdom was being rearticulated at its very point of inception in terms of devotional inclusivity. The new plethora of divine interactions inserted into the origin narrative suggests that the Mysore kingdom and the Wodeyar authority was being recast onto the metaphysical plane of divine interaction, and the Wodeyar kings positioned to rule within an entirely different sphere than the British counterparts. The supernatural thrust of the new narrative shows the manner in which the Mysore court was attempting to circumvent any British claims to authority over their kingdom by locating it within the realm of transcendence, and showing its precedent over the physical. In this way, Mummadi Krishnaraja's court was refashioning Wodeyar devotion and the lineage by forming a new idiom of kingship that was rooted in otherworldly notions of power. In order to see the full scale of this project, it is important to look beyond the textual traditions at other forms of artistic productions in which the kings of Mysore were also reimagined as rulers of a devotional realm. Visual representations, such as temple murals, to which we will now turn, show how the devotional landscape of all of India was ushered into the presence of the Wodeyar king and his lineage, attempting to demonstrate that Mysore was not only founded through their relationship with the divine, as we've just seen in the annals, but continued to be the capital of an Indian devotional empire under Mummadi Krishnaraja. So now we'll turn to the second sections in which we look at the murals of the Chitramantapa of the Venkateramana Swami temple in Mysore. In 1836, the Venkateramana Swami temple was constructed next to one of Mummadi Krishnaraja's palaces in Mysore. That's the Jagan Mohan Palace, if you're familiar with it. The temple houses a Chitramantapa, or painted hall, that pictorially displays the new approach to kingship, devotion, and territory that was being formulated during Mummadi Krishnaraja's reign. Before trying to analyze the murals, I think it's best to view the murals to get a sense of what's being represented. And I know with the glare it may be a little difficult, but we'll try to do our best. So the painted hall of the Venkateramana Swami temple contains murals that depict sacred sites within the Mysore kingdom, the South Indian region, and from various regions in northern India, especially surrounding and the two most sacred rivers in India. As you enter the tiny painted hall, the first portion of the walls to your left and right depict floor-to-ceiling images with large painted frames, which we see here in the slides behind me. One on the left is a collection of Vaishnava images containing depictions of several of Vishnu's incarnations, or avatars, along with various other characters that fill out the composition. On the right side, there's a large map of Tirupati, which, as we all know, is one of the most holy sites in South India. And here it depicts the festival image, or Utsava Murti, on procession up the hill around various smaller shrines and on its way to the main temple. So if I just turn behind me, this right here, again, if you can make it out, are images from the different avatars of Krishna, and then up here, different scenes from primarily the Bhagavata Purana. And then over here is where we see the map of Tirupati with the Utsava Murti going up from the mountain all the way into the Devasthana, or main temple. As you enter further into the hall, on both sides, there are two columns with small painted frames, or small paintings framed in wood depicting the Wodeyar kings. So that's what's projecting behind me now. And in this, it's throughout the entire place, all the different kings are eventually shown in different murals that are similar to this. And as you go farther in, next you begin to see a bird's eye view representation of the sacred sites of Mysore in South India. On the left and southern wall, there are 5 Vaishnava and 1 Shaiva centers that are shown, including those in the former Mysore and Vijayanagara capitals of Hampi and Srirangpatna. The murals on the right and northern wall depict 4 Vaishnava, 5 Shaiva, and 2 goddess temples, including Chamundeshwari. So again, I apologize if you can't see all of this, but we have a large image of Srirangpatna up here. We have different Veerashaiva sites here, like Navatirupati, and we have Hampi there. And then over here, we have other things, including Chamundi Hill, which is located right there. So they're representations of these sites from a bird's eye view. Then as we continue in, on the back or western wall, it completes the depiction of the Wodeyar kings, rounding out the entire lineage of 22. And then finally, we get to the ceiling, and on the ceiling, we see sacred places from farther away. These are northern sites that are represented. So here are depicted sites around the Shaiva Ganga, such as Kashi and Gangotri, And then in the other, we see the Vaishnava Braj area, such as Mathura and Vrindavan. And so if you are familiar with it, we get the big bend of Kashi here. And then up here, we have a lot of images from Braj also. All right, so here we see a slide of India, which hopefully will start to make sense a little bit more as we go through this. And I apologize, it seems to be flipped on my screen, but hopefully your mind can just flip it back correctly. Well, the cities, temples, and mattas are not depicted accurately by Western cartographic standards. In fact, it seems that the artists cared very little for representational accuracy. Instead, we recognize the sites because of the deities and their narrative signifiers. They clue the viewer to the identity and sacred significance of each site shown. Through the narrative allusions, the murals place the sacred sites temporally within mythological time and spatially within the realm of the transcendent. These murals reflect the same pan-Indian devotional cartography that we saw in the annals, in which deities, including the Mysore kings, are physically present and living within the mundane world, but simultaneously they're operating in transcendence of it. Additionally, the territory that is being depicted in the painted hall is not just the territory of the Mysore kingdom. It is the sacred geography of the whole of India, which places, symbolically and literally, the entire landscape of Indian devotion under the watchful gaze of the Mysore kings, who are also depicted in the hall. In order to fully grasp how the painted hall fits into the program of the Mysore court, we can turn to the epigraphic record of the temple to elucidate our analysis. Within this temple, there are two inscriptions that bear the signature of Mummadi Krishnaraja. The first inscription lists a series of donations, including the painted hall itself, which it tells us were given by the king to the priest of the temple, who is named Subarayadasa. So there's an image of, it's called in the inscription of Bhakti Vigraha of Subarayadasa that looks directly at the image of Venkateramana Swami in the Garbhagudi. The second inscription of the temple that bears Mummadi Krishnaraja's signature is a 75-line account of the life of the saint Subarayadasa that was carved into the inner walls of the temple's Ardhamantapa. This epigraph details the divine injunction given to Subarayadasa and his ensuing pilgrimage under the patronage of Mummadi Krishnaraja that was the impetus for the donation of the temple by the king. The inscription relates the entire story of the pilgrimage, which I, for the sake of time, will only summarize. The inscription states that in February of 1836, Subarayadasa was living off the patronage of Mummadi Krishnaraja Wodeyar's mother when there was an outbreak of cholera. At this dire time, Venkatesha, the form of Vishnu from Tirupati, appeared to the saint Subarayadasa as a young Sri Vaishnava boy and instructed the saint to distribute prasada, or blessed food, to the people afflicted by cholera, and if he did so, they would be completely healed of their disease. After completing this miraculous task, he was directed by the same deity to go to the palace to perform puja. After doing so, the king bestowed upon him a variety of royal gifts. After this, Subarayadasa went on a pilgrimage to Tirupati. This very act caused sacred water to appear in Subarayadasa's home, which was immediately taken to the king. Upon his return to Mysore, the saint was again directed in a dream to go on a pilgrimage, and informed the king of his desire to do so. Mummadi Krishnaraja then provided Subarayadasa with all the accoutrement necessary for the journey, including giving him his royal insignia or baruda and permissions and passports from the king and from the East India Company resident. Then the saint embarked on a massive pilgrimage that included more than 68 different cities, including all of those painted in the hall murals, and even more royal and sacred sites throughout India. So here we see the map with the same sites. Again, the map had previously marked out all the places that we saw in the painted hall, and this now maps out exactly where he goes. So you see that he actually moves through every single site that's depicted in the hall. At the end of his journey, Subarayadasa returned to the Mysore palace, where he presented all the gifts before the king and anointed the ruler with water from the Ganga. In honor of his journey, the king constructed the Venkateramana Swami temple with its painted hall and bequeathed to Subaraya Dasa, his family, and to his deity many gifts to be used in the temple, and a stipend of 100 rupees per month to be paid to the same. The details of the story are reminiscent of the pilgrimage of the Wodeyar brothers, who founded the Mysore kingdoms, and it was included and eventually be written in the annals 30 years later. For instance, 1, the pilgrimage was undertaken at the behest of a manifestation of Vishnu. 2, several important cities, temples, and kingdoms were visited along the way. And 3, and lastly, the pilgrimage ultimately culminated in the anointing of a Wodeyar king. But of course, this story is very different in other important details. It's not a Wodeyar who goes on the journey, and the journey originates and culminates in Mysore. So what are we to make of this intriguing inscription, the pilgrimage that it describes, and its commemoration in the temple murals? One way to look at inscription is simply as a historical record of a historical journey undertaken by the Saint Subaraya Dasa for the attainment of merit for himself, his family, and his ruler. Art historian Robert J. Darpana has suggested about this temple that the collection of pilgrimage experiences in the murals reflects the sanctity of the man Subaraya Dasa and also adds to the sanctity of the temple that he has built. But if this is the case, one must ask, why does the king play such an important role in the narrative, and why has the entire Wodeyar lineage been depicted amongst the sacred sites? I think the answer lies in a deeper interpretation of the king and not the pilgrim as the central character. So I would alter Darpana's conclusion, highlighting that the person responsible for the pilgrimage, the temple, and the paintings, and the person who is being aggrandized in all the same, is not Subaraya Dasa and his temple, but the king, Mummadi Krishnaraja, and his kingdom. Moreover, Subaraya Dasa is not only a miracle-working saint, but he is also a servant of the court, and thereby a servant of Mummadi Krishnaraja. He performs puja within the palace, and his pilgrimage is funded by the Maharaja. His journey even began and ended in the presence of the king. For me, then, Subaraya Dasa is not a mere pilgrim. He is a royal emissary on a devotional mission. He acts like the emissaries of the medieval period, who traveled to the far reaches of the imperial territory to collect tribute from his vassals. However, Subaraya Dasa is not just collecting gifts from royal vassals. He was collecting gifts from royalty, leaders of mattas, temple priests, and even installing temples in faraway sacred sites such as Benares or Varanasi. He was traversing a sacred domain, collecting tribute with metaphysical significance, the significance of which was far outside the purview of the British. Therefore, this pilgrimage and its attendant inscriptions and murals has to be viewed in light of the rearticulation of kingly identity through devotion that was taking place in the annals. Subaraya Dasa's journey was a symbolic journey that displayed the devotional virtuosity of Mummadi Krishnaraja's court, culminating in the final scene in which the saint presents the royal temple gifts that he'd collected to Mummadi Krishnaraja and anoints the Wodeyar king with water from the Ganga, a form of Abhisheka. This was a stark contrast to the king's original coronation in 1799, when he was given his royal insignia and crowned by the British Governor General. This scene depicts a new and true recoronation of Mummadi Krishnaraja, not as a ruler of an earthly domain granted by a colonial power, but as the ruler of a devotional realm, an incorporeal emperor whose transcendent power was given by the goddess and not bounded by British control. The murals then draw the entire world of Indian devotion into the presence of the king and his lineage. So here we have Krishnaraja Wodeyar in the mural. All right, so I'm drawing everything together with my conclusion now. So I'll leave you in the same vein as we began, with a very brief vision of contemporary Mysore from December 2013, at the time of the late Maharaja's funeral, just a few short months after we had met and discussed my research. Again, we are escorted within the palace literally built by the British, and the ritual hall in which the painting of the former rulers and ministers of Mysore line the wall. And you can see the images from the funeral behind me. In the ritual program of the funeral, we see the fruition of the vast pan-Indic devotional program of Mummadi Krishnaraja's court, as the ritual and its participants mirror both the murals of the Venkataramana Swami temple and the annals. Before the funeral began, representatives of all the major Indian princely states and at least one former prime minister flew to Mysore in order to attend the Maharaja's final rites, ushering all the regions of India once again before the Mysore king and the pictorial representations of his lineage. The funerary puja was led by the Sri Vaishnava priest from the temple at Melakote. They gave way to the priest of Chamundeshwari and then the priest of Nanjandeshwara Trineshwara, following the original pilgrimage in the annals. All the while, a huge image of the goddess that had been placed on the throne watched over the proceedings. Then when the king was finally taken to the funeral ground, his body was met by the Virashaiva preceptor, who oversaw the cremation of the body, a seemingly contradictory duty since, as we know, Virashaivas do not cremate but bury their dead. And this, of course, was an oddity that none of the priests had an explanation for whenever I asked. And this, of course, might have been part of a post hoc insertion of the tradition into the ritual program of the Mysore court. So we can see that the inclusive devotional program that had attempted to refashion the kingship in colonial Mysore has left a lasting effect on the ritual complex of the region that is present even today. So when we look back at the artistic productions from the region and the reign of Mummadi Krishnaraja, it becomes clear that his court was attempting to create a new identity for Mysore and its rulers. The means through which the court attempted to constitute kingship in this period marked a major shift in Wodeyar representations, namely fashioning their rulers and the very notion of kingship through devotional traditions. That provided a new vision of modern pan-Indian devotional tradition, what we now commonly think of whenever we use the term Hinduism. I do not believe that this reflected a vain attempt to keep faith in light of British domination or reflecting British notions of religion, but that the court of Mummadi Krishnaraja was recreating and re-articulating the very nature of kingship in order to subvert the rule of the British overlords. Through enacting rhetoric of devotion and metaphysical power, Mummadi Krishnaraja's power was being relocated within the realm of the transcendent, an incorporeal empire, and the Mysore kingdom extended throughout the pan-Indian devotional map. Thank you. So we can open it up and take questions now. I see that there's some in the chat. I don't know, Pradeep, are you going to moderate the discussion?
Yes. Yeah, exactly. One question from Shashikant Kaudur, which is like this. Partha Chatterjee argues that Indian nationalist struggle used the binary of the spiritual and the material, where the Indian nationalists claimed their legitimacy and in fact supremacy over the West in the domain of the spiritual. Do you suggest to advance that binary position by a century's time? Shashikanta Kaudur, NITK Suratkalu.
Excellent question. Yeah, I mean, I understand Chatterjee's position and think that that binary position of the spiritual India and materialist West is certainly something that was important. But I don't necessarily think that this is a hard binary because I don't see the two as being completely unrelated. Because, I mean, to go back to Mummadi Krishnaraja's reign, the problem was he didn't have military or administrative power. They had stripped most of the, he was living on a stipend. He couldn't tax, he couldn't create agraharas. He couldn't create inam. So a lot of his power over wealth, administration, military was gone. But to be king, you have to be king over something. You have to be sovereign over one thing or another. So I think it was a matter of him searching for what his sovereignty was. And the place that he could locate it that the British could never take away was that he was a bhakta. He worshipped the gods. His power was from the gods. He was from Yadu Vamsha, and no matter what the British did, they couldn't stop that. So I don't think that it was necessarily him just moving into the sphere of the spiritual because India was more religious or spiritual, but that this was the one place that was remaining for him to actually exert his power and his sovereignty. So instead of creating tax-free land grants through agraharams or inams, now he can give cash and build temples, which may seem like a small shift, but for me it's a very large shift because it means that he's moved from the realm of giving in a sovereign exception to now he's moved to the sphere of being engaged in bhakti as opposed to a different type of in exchange with the religious institutions. So hopefully that answers the great question, though.
There is a question by Vagishwari SP. She's a professor in Christ University, Bangalore. Can the wedding of Chamundeshwari and Nanjundeshwara be considered similar to Meenakshi Sundareshwara union and as an example of appropriation of non-elite identity for political and cultural legitimacy?
I think it is certainly used that way. That it's something that sort of makes it into the elite court, and of course you see in this a change because the folk songs that I'm working on right now have very little concern for elite issues. The songs are primarily concerned with caste, with domestic rituals, whether or not you should sacrifice chickens, things like this. But the names that they use are always Chamundeshwari, Nanjundeshwara. When you see it incorporated into the courtly elite, their names start to change. They'll of course be called Chamundeshwari, they'll be called Nanjundeshwara, but now they're also called Shiva Parvati a lot. And that's something you don't see in the local versions of the story. But the story is so popular that you see the wedding of Nanjundeshwara and Chamundeshwari told many different ways, depending on which perspective. If it's more from a courtly, what we might call like Brahminical telling, versus something that's coming out of like Kamsale songs. They have very different concerns and very different names, and the wedding happens very differently also in these different sides. So I think it's a story that has been used for sort of to expansion of political and cultural legitimacy, but it remains in its parallel form as folk songs that provide a different form of meaning for different people. Great question.
Question by S.K. Aruni, the director of ICHR Bangalore, Southern Region. Do you get the incidence of Veerashaiva Jangamas performing religious rituals in Mysore rulers?
I'm less familiar with the contemporary setting. And the reason why I brought it in is just because I happen to be in the palace for these things and notice some interesting overlap. In the sources that I'm more familiar with, which are these early 19th century sources going back, outside of the annals, there's very few courtly things that talk about Veerashaivas in a positive light. I've tried to trace the story of the Jangama in this foundation narrative. The earliest reference that I actually see it expressed is actually not even in Kannada. The first time I ever see it is in Wilkes's History of Mysore, and it's a footnote that says that there are some Jangamas in the court who tell the story this way. So it's a pretty new story. But if you go back to especially like the reign of Chikadevaraya, he really dislikes Virashaivas. And so a lot of the polemics coming out of the court are actually how Virashaivas ought to be punished and how their theology is bad. So there's not a long history of Jangama, but in the 18th century, when the Kalales sort of usurp the power, that at the moment they usurp power, they're the Dalavais, and they become the rulers. And then all of a sudden you start to see a warming up to Shaivism in general. And so this might be where some Virashaivas start to be added to the court, even though they're not extremely popular later on. So it's a good question about now, what sort of rituals they're doing in the court. And I wish I knew more about the contemporary setting. But like I said, they are the maintainers of the Madhuvarna, the cremation site for the Wodeyar kings. It's maintained by Virashaivas, which I'd be interested also in hearing some of your thoughts, because I find that very odd that people who bury their dead and don't cremate are also the people who look over the cremation grounds for the kings. So it's just something that has always perplexed me.
Question from Madhavi MK. She's teaching history in Mysore. Do we see these elements of subversion in the copious religious literature rich literature he created? In the copies of religious literature he created?
Yeah, I think so. You could argue with me on this, but I think just by the fact that he creates so much of this, it's so much like what's coming out of the Tanjore court just a few years earlier, that all of a sudden you have kings that are like the new Boja, just creating all of these different religious texts. But if you look at even the pen name of Mumadi Krishnaraja in all the yakshaganas that he wrote and all of the hymns, he also signs them as Sri Chamundeshwari, which shows again this connection between him and the goddess, which I think gets to this this subversion that he's wanting to emphasize, that his power doesn't come from the British, but it comes from the goddess or the divine. And to me, this itself is a huge subversion, because the British, if you read their remarks, all of it is said that they have made him king. They've made him king. And everything he does is saying, no, Chamundi made me king, which to me is a very subversive approach. And so again, like I said, it's implicit. So we could argue whether or not that actually is subversion, but I think it is. Thanks, Madhu.
Question from Ramesh SL. He's teaching history in Kadur Government College. Is the king's religious sovereignty affected his political sovereignty?
Yeah, another fantastic question. His political sovereignty was so fraught. And when you read the letters that he was writing back to the governor general, and even ones that he was writing to the queen toward the end of his time, while he's doing all these things, he also is very concerned with with being bestowed full sovereignty again. So he's always writing about, can you restore my kingdom fully? Can I have back my administration? Can I have a military? And they always say no, over and over again. So at the very end, he actually turns the tide and basically says, all right, I can't have it. Can I adopt a son? And can my son have it? They allow the adoption to go through, but they never actually, while he's living, give him back his political sovereignty. And, I'm not sure why, but I think part of it may have backfired, his idea of religious sovereignty, because he emphasized so much that he was Yaduvamsha, and that he was, his Abhisheka was from spiritually through Chamundeshwari. And so I think that maybe he wasn't allowed to be restored his full administration because they thought his bloodline was too strong. And we could talk about the curse of Alamelama if you want to. But basically, I think that once he adopted a son and they knew it wasn't a biological heir, that they could re-grant a lot of the administrative powers. Of course, that's what they do. Once Chamaraja, the 10th, comes of age, they give him back a lot of administrative power that they had taken from Mummadi Krishnaraja. And then this is when they become the model princely state, with Chamaraja the 10th and eventually into Nalwadi Krishnaraja. And of course, we all know the benefits that happened during Nalwadi Krishnaraja with electric lights, KRS Dam, and all of these things. So I think it probably negatively affected his political sovereignty by making these claims of being from Yaduvamsha, being sort of a divine king. But this is actually a question that I haven't really fully explored because that last part of his reign, I'm interested in it, but I've been more interested in the adoption process, just thinking about issues of biological bloodlines and how Indian Vamshas work a little differently than their European counterparts with biological succession of kingship. But it's something I would love to continue to discuss with you, and this with everyone. Like, feel free to, once we have to get off here, we can continue the discussion via email, and I could probably articulate my ideas a little bit more thoroughly with a little bit more thought. But thank you for that question, Ramesh. That was great.
There is a good question by Dr. K. Guruswamy. Is teaching social science in a school in Hole Narsipura, Hasana. He wants to know, what is your view on Tipu Sultan to the contribution of Hindu religious devotional centers in Mysore state in the early Krishnaraja Wodeyar III?
Yeah. I was wondering if this question would come up. So I also work, and my book is half about Tipu Sultan, half about Mummadi Krishnaraja. Tipu Sultan is such a complex character, historical character, that is very difficult to summarize in a book, 2 books, probably even a lifetime, because his character in and of itself seems to be very contradictory when you look at his entire vita of everything that he does. The tendency for scholars is to look at him either as almost like a pluralist, someone who's extremely tolerant, or someone who's extremely intolerant. And there's evidence to support both sides of those. Of course, he grants agraharas to Brahmins. He gives inams to temples. He also, especially from Kerala, destroys temples and breaks murtis and all these things. So you can make an argument, but I think all of it sort of masks something broader going on. And I'm actually working on an article right now specifically about this, that what do we make of Sultan's almost dual nature, the Janus face, the two sides of the coin. And my argument is that these are really old ways of being a Muslim king in India. And this goes back to Mahmud of Ghazni, it goes back to Akbar, to where if you're a Muslim in India, a lot of rules and prescriptions about how you operate with non-monotheist inhibit what you're allowed to do. And so Tipu Sultan, I think, finds creative ways to get around some of those. And my main example in this article I'm working on is his famous relationship with the Jagat Guru of Sringeri that I also talk about in my book, in which we can actually see through the letters where they corresponded that he offers the Jagat Guru a lot of gifts, including royal gifts. And then in return, the Jagat Guru does different rituals, different pujas, different homas, all to Sharada. So it's a weird interaction when you think about Tipu Sultan, but at the same time, it shows us that really what he's doing is a very old way of forming a peace treaty by swearing an oath through the exchange of gifts and ritual. So to get back to your actual question about what sort of his, if I understood it correctly, the legacy of Tipu Sultan during Muhammadi Krishnaraja. I think that his legacy is extremely complex because on one side, he becomes the enemy of the British. So by the British hating him so much, he's contrasted with Muhammadi Krishnaraja. So it's the bad Muslim usurper, the restoration of the Hindu line. So you have those two things that are weighed. And so Muhammadi Krishnaraja kind of always gets the benefit of the doubt when it comes to sort of being the harbinger of ancient religion. So it opens up a space for him to make all of these subversions by being in contrast with a Muslim, if that makes sense. So the only way he can claim to be this, his devotional sovereignty is because he's being compared to Tipu Sultan. And I would love to hear what you think of that, either now or in email later, because it's something that I do struggle with, and I think everyone struggles with, which makes Tipu Sultan so interesting to talk about.
A question from Yashaswini Sharma. Between 1800 and 1804, Agraharas were built by Muhammadi's queens. So Muhammadi not having any say and no Agrahara having been established might not be entirely accurate. There are inscriptions to this effect in inscriptions in the Prasanna Nanjundeshwara Swami temple in Santepete. Have you examined them? Doesn't Muhammadi sign as Sri Krishna?
Yes. So maybe I misspoke in the paper. Muhammadi Krishnaraja gives Agraharas and Inams all the way till 1831. There's tons of evidence of this. So in 1800, 1804, Krishnaraja is not old enough to do these. He's not old enough to actually grant Agraharas until 1811. So it's 1811 to 1831 is the period of his direct rule. So there we see so many Agraharas, so many Inams. And in fact, this is why the British take control. In a lot of letters that they write to him in like 1828, there's a cholera outbreak, and this causes issues, and then there's a famine, and so there's some money issues going on in Mysore, and he's still granting Agraharas, he's still granting Inams, and the British say enough. Like you're not paying us enough money, and you're giving all your money to these Brahmins, to these temples. You have to stop giving these land grants. Then you have the Nagara Rebellion, 1831. The British step in and say, this is because you've mismanaged money. And then they take over. And from there on out, he's not allowed to give tax breaks. So after 1831, then there's no Agraharas, no Inams. Now, people like Janaki Nair, who I really respect her work on Mysore, she's fantastic, then sort of sees him as shifting to a life of luxury, kind of relaxing. But I've gone through and cataloged every single inscription that is in Epigraphia Karnataka or South Indian inscriptions from this time period. And actually, he still continues to give very liberally to temples. He just doesn't have the power to grant Agraharas or Inams. So instead, what he does is he gives cash, he gives gold, he gives jewels. And so he changes his process. But this gets us to the issue of sovereignty. After 1831, he doesn't have the power to give an Agrahara or an Inam, which if you go back to anything in medieval India, this is really how you express sovereignty. Of course, you can fight battles, but really how you do it is you're granting someone the right to not pay taxes and to live off of that tax income.
We have a question from Somashekar that do you think it is appropriate to rely on the terms and concepts which you have used, such as sovereignty, temple, goddess, Hinduism, religion, etc., which are more non-Indian and European, to understand the socio-cultural dynamics here? Don't you think it would fall short of making proper interpretation? Don't you think this is a kind of anomaly?
Yeah, I mean, it can be. Yeah, so I mean, a lot of these terms I find equivalence in the text that I'm looking at. And of course, they may not be direct equivalents, but that's part of what my broader work is interested in. So terms like sovereignty and thinking about succession. And so of course, these are English terms that whenever we say it, often it's reflected back into English historiography, not just English language, but also English history. So think about like bloodlines and how those things spread, which this is not the case in India, obviously. And one thing that I think is why I'm interested in the adoption process is because adoption in India, especially posthumous adoption, is something that regularly occurs and is not seen as a break in sovereignty or succession. In England, it was. So it's a huge debate over the nature of someone's authority, someone's succession. And so it's actually in my broader work, this is something that I'm really interested in thinking about, is how these same concepts are viewed very differently in India and in other places of the world. So for me, especially as a religious studies historian instead of a different type of historian, I'm interested in looking at these cross-cultural concepts and seeing how they develop differently in different places, and trying to help everyone understand a little bit more about how this affected the colonial negotiations. And in my actual written version of this, and I didn't always say them, but often I'll have the Kannada term that I'm translating. So if I say temple, in back behind it, it'll say Devasthana. If I say goddess, it'll say behind it, whatever's used in the text, like Devate or Grama Devate. Hinduism, when I'm actually talking about it, I don't really think that that's an effective term to talk about what's going on in these texts, which is why I use Shaivism, Vaishnavism, Shaktism, because those are actually the terms that are more meaningful. But I do think it's important to try to expand the scope of these and see how they compare with things outside of India as well. But of course, I take that critique wholeheartedly. It would be fantastic if we didn't have to translate all of these terms, but typically when I'm writing to an English-speaking audience who necessarily doesn't know Kannada. And so it's not just, in America, but it's also in Europe and in India, to where, not everybody knows Kannada. And most of my work tends to be in Kannada printed texts or manuscripts. So my goal is partly to make this history open and engageable with a broader audience. But thank you so much, Shekhar.
A question from Dr. Asha Krishnaswamy, journalist from Mysore. What is your take on the claims and controversy of Mahishasura? Where does Chamundeshwari figure, or what place she has in this controversy?
Is this about the controversy of like a Mahishasura Puja instead of Navratri?
It seems so.
Okay. Yeah, it's, Mahishasura is a little different, I think, from Mysore than the rest of the country, just because you go up Chamundi Hill and the first thing you see when you get off a bus is not the goddess, but actually Mahishasura, right? So he's a asura, he's a demon, if we translate it back to English, but he's not necessarily all bad, which I think also reflects his Puranic identity. Yeah, he goes bad. He eventually starts to steal the different portions of the sacrifice from the devas, but he also was very righteous. He received boons from, depending on which text, Brahma, Indra. So he has that. There's a positivity there also, and I think you see that in Mysore, the pride of it being the former kingdom of Mahishasura, at least mythologically. You see it in the statue there. So I think that Mysore actually might provide different avenues for people to have this discussion about whether, what it means to have killed Mahishasura. And maybe that could be a fruitful place for people to start reconsidering this controversy from, as opposed to being like opposite ends of the spectrum, but actually to think about the positives of an asura. I mean, the same thing's true with like Ravana. Like most of these asuras and rakshasas in the Puranas and in Itihasa are righteous, at least at some point. So I think that could be a beginning place for a conversation to where people could at least see one another's perspectives.
Another question from Shashikant Kaudur. The medieval Vijayanagara kingdom too derived its power from the temples and mutt establishments. Similarly, we see Vyasaraya, who was one of the prominent individuals in the Dasa tradition, of which Subbaraya Dasa was a part. In that sense, the connectedness of the mutt, temple and the monk Dasa is not something new that way.
No, I don't think that many of the things that are being done in Mysore are necessarily new. And I mean, I think about the Vyasaraya, Vijayanagara. Of course, I think of Valerie Stoker's book, which I believe make a lot of very similar arguments to what my take is. And in fact, I was writing all this whenever her book was published. That I think something happens as in Vijayanagara, as the temple expands, they're trying to also send out different religious leaders to, as Stoker calls it, make a big tent to include a lot of devotional traditions. I think what makes the two cases different and interesting to compare is time frame. Of course, Vijayanagara, when this is happening, they're at the height of their empire, with Krishnaraja Wodeyar, and so it's an expansion project that also includes military expansion. Of course, they have their issues in the north at that point too. But with Mummadi Krishnaraja, his is a different kind of expansion. So it's not him ruling over everything the same way that Krishnaraja Wodeyar did. Mummadi Krishnaraja is trying to just carve out some space. But you're right that this is the same exact process, just in a slightly different context. And, these dasas, these, whatever you want to call them, these sannyasas, they have a particular ability to do this because of their role as religious leaders, but also as politically important people.
The second question by Dr. S.K. Aruni. How were the reactions from the British commissioners making legitimization of the rule by Mysore Maharaja, Mummadi Krishnaraja Wodeyar, in association of religious rituals?
Yeah, they thought throughout his entire career, they always found it irritating. And they don't really talk much about whether or not, like, he's explicitly, at least, whether or not he's like a divine king, but they always find that he's so religious. One of the reasons why not to give him back his kingdom. So they actually, in my house, I have framed a newspaper article that talks about this. They say that he's like, I think they say a very good gentleman, but like very bad with money. And so that keeps being sort of the rhetoric that comes out, that he's like too religious and particularly in his donations, to be a good king. So we find this really interesting contrast between what I think it's doing for him and how the British are perceiving it. And I think that it's something like his program of talking about Yaduvamsha, talking about Chamundeshwari, establishing his lineage, is something that really is only intelligible within the Indian context. And in fact, whenever Srikantadatta Narasimharaja Wodeyar died, and I had this in the epilogue to my book, when I was getting up and reading the different Mysore daily newspapers, I was really surprised to see the headlines. All of them are like, Yaduvamsha too, or in the English ones, like the Yaduvamsha has now ended. And I was really struck by this because that rhetoric of Yaduvamsha is still so important. And in fact, I think that's probably the reason why someone like him would be elected to parliament, why he could be elected right before he died to be the president of the Karnataka Cricket Association. Very important positions. That he was an able person in many regards, but there may have been more able people, except for the fact that he was Yaduvamsha. And so I think this was something important that the British never quite wrapped their heads around. Had you said that he was something like from the Tudor line or something like this, that would have made sense to them, but they didn't quite understand this aspect. So they kind of saw it as, I don't know, something different, not a legitimate claim or something like that. But I think it was meaningful for his people. It was meaningful for his court. It was meaningful for him to where he could say, this is where my sovereignty lies. This is what I'm king over. So I think that there was this huge disconnect, and all the British were caring about was, this is a place to where he just spends too much money.
Thank you, everyone, for raising questions and participating in a good and healthy debate. ಒಂದು ಪ್ರಶ್ನೆ BS ಸೋಮಶೇಖರ್ ಅವರು, ಇಟ್ಸ್ ನಾಟ್ ಫಾರ್ ಕ್ಯಾಲಬ್ ಸಿಮನ್ಸ್. ಸೋಮಶೇಖರ್ ಅವರೇ, ಈ ಫೋರಂ ಬೆಂಗಳೂರು ಹಿಸ್ಟೋರಿಯನ್ ಸೊಸೈಟಿ ಮತ್ತು ಈ ಸಂವಾದ ಏನಿದೆ, ಇದು ಅತ್ಯಂತ ಮುಕ್ತವಾಗಿ ಮಾತಾಡ್ಲಿಕ್ಕೆ ಮತ್ತು ಎಲ್ಲರೂ ತಮ್ಮ ಅಭಿಪ್ರಾಯವನ್ನ, ಯಾವುದೇ ಅಭಿಪ್ರಾಯನೂ ಹಂಚ್ಕೊಳ್ಳಿಕ್ಕೆ ಇರತಕ್ಕಂತಹ ವೇದಿಕೆ. ಇದು ಯಾವುದೇ ಒಂದು ಸಿದ್ಧಾಂತ ಅಥವಾ ಆ ರೀತಿ ಒಂದೇ ಸಿದ್ಧಾಂತ ಆ ರೀತಿ ಅದ್ರ ಪರವಾಗಿ ಆ ರೀತಿ ಏನಿಲ್ಲ. ಮುಕ್ತವಾಗಿ, ಫಾರ್ ಎಕ್ಸಾಂಪಲ್ ಇದರ ಕ್ಯಾಪ್ಷನ್ ಅರಿವಿನ ನಿರಿಗೆ ಅನ್ನೋದು ಅಲ್ಲಮ ಪ್ರಭುವಿನ ಒಂದು ವಚನದಿಂದ ಆಯ್ದುಕೊಂಡಂತಹ ಒಂದು ನುಡಿಗಟ್ಟು. ಅರಿವಿನ ನಿರಿಗೆ ಅಂತಕ್ಕಂಥ ಒಂದು ಐಡಿಯಾನೇ ಒಂದು ಡಯಲೆಕ್ಟಿಕಲ್ ಸ್ವರೂಪದಲ್ಲಿ, ಒಂದು ಸಂವಾದದ ಸ್ವರೂಪದಲ್ಲಿ ವಾದ ಪ್ರತಿವಾದ, ಅದು ವಾದಕ್ಕೆ ಇನ್ನೊಂದು ವಾದ ಮಂಡನೆಯಾಗಿ, ಮತ್ತೊಂದು ಪ್ರತಿವಾದ ಮಂಡನೆಯಾಗಿ, ಅದು ಮುರಿಯಲ್ಪಟ್ಟು ಮತ್ತೊಂದು ವಾದ ರಚನೆಯಾಗಿ, ಅಂದ್ರೆ ಅಲೆಗಳ ರೀತಿಯಲ್ಲಿ ಒಂದು ಸಂವಾದವನ್ನ ಸೃಷ್ಟಿಸ್ತಕ್ಕಂತಹ ಒಂದು ಸಾಧ್ಯತೆಯನ್ನ ಏರ್ಪಡಿಸುವ ನೆಲೆಯಿಂದಲೇ ನಾವು ಆರಂಭ ಮಾಡಿದ್ದು. ಆ ದೃಷ್ಟಿಯಿಂದ ಎಲ್ಲ ರೀತಿಯ ಅಭಿಪ್ರಾಯಗಳಿಗೂ ಕೂಡ ಇಲ್ಲಿ ಸ್ವಾಗತ ಇದೆ. ಆ ರೀತಿ ಏನಿಲ್ಲ. ಸೊ ನಿಮ್ಮ ಪ್ರಶ್ನೆಯನ್ನು ಕೂಡ ನಾವು ಪ್ರತಿನಿಧೀಕರಿಸಿದ್ದೀವಿ, ನೀವು ರೆಪ್ರೆಸೆಂಟ್ ಮಾಡಿದ್ದೀವಿ. ಆ ದೃಷ್ಟಿಯಿಂದ ನಾವು ನಮ್ಮ ಅಭಿಪ್ರಾಯವನ್ನು ಸ್ಪಷ್ಟಪಡಿಸ್ತಾ ಇದ್ದೀವಿ. ಕೊನೆಯ ಒಂದು ಪ್ರಶ್ನೆಯೊಟ್ಟಿಗೆ ನಾವು ಇದನ್ನ ನಮ್ಮ ಸೆಷನ್ ಅನ್ನ ಮುಗಿಸ್ತಾ ಇದ್ದೀವಿ. ಮತ್ತು ಆದಷ್ಟು ಸಂವಾದದ ಜೊತೆ ಸಾಧಿಸ್ಕೋಬೇಕು, ನಮ್ಮನ್ನ ಒಳಗೊಳ್ಬೇಕು, ತೊಡಸ್ಕೊಳ್ಬೇಕು ಅನ್ನೋ ಒಂದೇ ಒಂದು ಉದ್ದೇಶ. ಎಲ್ಲ ಅಭಿಪ್ರಾಯಗಳು ಬರ್ಲಿ, ಡಿಸ್ಕಷನ್ ಆಗ್ಲಿ, ಡಿಬೇಟ್ ಆಗ್ಲಿ. ಆ ದೃಷ್ಟಿಯಿಂದ ಫೋರಂ ಇರೋದು, ಸಂವಾದ ಇರೋದು ಮತ್ತು ಅರಿವಿನ ನಿರಿಗೆ ಇರೋದು. ಮತ್ತು ಯಾವ ನಿರಿಗೆಯೂ ಶಾಶ್ವತವಾದ ನಿರಿಗೆ ಅಲ್ಲ. ಎಲ್ಲ ನಿರಿಗೆಗಳು, ಈಗ ಫಾರ್ ಎಕ್ಸಾಂಪಲ್ ಸೀರೆಗೆ ಯಾವುದೋ ಒಂದು ಚೆನ್ನಾಗಿ ಗಟ್ಟಿ ಇಸ್ತ್ರಿ ಹಾಕಿ ನಿರಿಗೆ ಮಾಡಿದ್ರು ಕೂಡ ಆ ನಿರಿಗೆ ಫೈನಲ್ ಆದ ನಿರಿಗೆ ಅಲ್ಲ. ಒಂದು ಕಾಲಾಂತರದಲ್ಲಿ ಆ ನಿರಿಗೆ ಸಂಪೂರ್ಣ ಫೇಡ್ ಆಗುತ್ತೆ, ಸಂಪೂರ್ಣ ಹಳದಾಗುತ್ತೆ, ಸಂಪೂರ್ಣ ನೀರಿಗೆ ಹೊರಟೋಗುತ್ತೆ. ಮತ್ತೊಂದು ಹೊಸ ನೀರಿಗೆ ಬೇಕು, ಪುನಃ ಅದು ಹೊರಟೋಗುತ್ತೆ, ಮತ್ತೊಂದು ಹೊಸ ನೀರಿಗೆ ಬೇಕು. ಸೊ ಒಂದು ನಿರಂತರವಾದ ಸಂವಾದದ ಸ್ಥಿತಿಯನ್ನು ಸಾಧಿಸುವ ಉದ್ದೇಶದಿಂದ ನಾವು ಈ ಫೋರಂ ಮತ್ತು ಪ್ರೋಗ್ರಾಮ್ ಅನ್ನು ಹಮ್ಮಿಕೊಂಡಿರೋದು. ಕೊನೆಯ ಪ್ರಶ್ನೆ ಯಶಸ್ವಿನಿ ಶರ್ಮಾ ಅವರದು. ಹ್ಯಾವ್ ಯು ಎಕ್ಸಾಮಿನ್ ಫಾರ್ ಕ್ಯಾಲಬ್, have you examined religious texts when you explore relationship of kind and divine for king bar ruler as manifestation of the divine Raja Pratyaksha Devata is a familiar notion in Indian landscape?
Yes, and especially in earlier text, and this is something that I find in the Mysore context much earlier. So with people like let's see, like Raja Wodeyar, for instance. I'm blanking out on some of the other inscriptions that I'm thinking of, but it's very common in early 17th century text for them to say like basically that the king is an avatar of Vishnu. Usually in the Mysore context, they're associated with Narasimha. So I think that it's something that's constantly there that we see a very little bit within the annals, to where Raja Wodeyar, as I mentioned in the talk, is said that he rides a white horse to Melkote, walks into Chalavanarayana Swami, and becomes one with the main murti in the Garbhagudi. And so if you go to Melkote, you go to Chalavanarayana Swami, there's a Bhakti Vigraha of Raja Wodeyar that faces the Garbhagudi and the main murti. It's about this tall, so it's a very small one, but the story is there, and you see it in the annals. So there's a slight hint at it, but of course, when he writes the text, when Mumari writes it, there's a British resident. So I think that he is careful with the way that he talks about himself as a divine king, or as some sort of devata himself, because ultimately he's subordinated to the queen of England. So I think that would cause some issues with them. And at the end of the day, what he really wants is he wants his full kingship back. So he doesn't want to rock the boat too much.
ಎಲ್ರಿಗೂ ಕೂಡ ಧನ್ಯವಾದ. ಮತ್ತು ಎಸ್ಪೆಷಲಿ ಕ್ಯಾಲಬ್ ಸಿಮನ್ಸ್ ಅವರಿಗೆ, ನಾವು ಆಕ್ಚುಲಿ ಯುರೋಪಿನವರ ಇದು ತುಂಬಾ ಇಂಪಾರ್ಟೆಂಟ್ ಆದ ಪ್ರಶ್ನೆಯನ್ನ ಸೋಮಶೇಖರ್ ಎತ್ತಿದ್ದಾರೆ. 2 ಕಾರಣಕ್ಕೆ. ಒಂದು, ಯುರೋಪ್ ಅಥವಾ ಪಶ್ಚಿಮ ಭಾರತವನ್ನು ಹೇಗ್ ನೋಡ್ಲಿಕ್ಕೆ ಸಾಧ್ಯ ಇದೆ? ಯಾಕೆಂದ್ರೆ ಭಾರತ ಅನ್ನುವ ಒಂದು ಸ್ಥಿತಿ ಇದೆ ಅನ್ನುವ ನೆಲೆಯಲ್ಲಿ ಅವರು ಕೆಲವು ಮಂಡನೆಗಳನ್ನ, ಇಂತಹ ಅನೇಕ ಒಂದು ವಾದವನ್ನ ಮಂಡಿಸುವ ಸ್ಥಿತಿ ಇದೆ ನಮ್ಮಲ್ಲಿ. ಆದ್ರೆ ಒಂದು ರೀತಿಯ ಭಾರತ ಇದೆ ಅನ್ನುವ ಒಂದು ಸ್ಥಿತಿ ಅಥವಾ ಪ್ರಶ್ನೆ, ಒಂದು ಜಿಜ್ಞಾಸೆ ಕೂಡ ಇದೆ. ಒಂದು ರೀತಿ ಭಾರತ ಇಲ್ಲ, ಕೊನೆಗೆ ಇರುವುದು ಹಲವು ಭಾರತ. ಹಾಗಿದ್ರೆ ಹಲವು ಪ್ರತಿನಿಧೀಕರಣ ಮತ್ತು ಹಲವು ವ್ಯಾಖ್ಯಾನಗಳು, ಹಲವು ನಿರೂಪಣೆಗಳು. ಆದ್ರೆ ಇಂತಹ ಹಲವು ನಿರೂಪಣೆಗಳನ್ನ ಪಶ್ಚಿಮ ಗಮನಿಸುವ ರೀತಿ ಇದೆಯಲ್ಲ, ಅದು ವೆರಿ ಇಂಟ್ರೆಸ್ಟಿಂಗ್. ಬಹುಶಃ ಅದೃಷ್ಟಿಯಿಂದ ಪಶ್ಚಿಮದ ಅಧ್ಯಯನಗಳು ಯಾಕೆ ಮುಖ್ಯ ಅನ್ನೋದು ಈ ಕಾರಣಕ್ಕೆ. ಒಂದು. ಎರಡನೇದು, ನಾವು ಬೇರೆ ಬೇರೆ ಚಿಂತನ ಶಾಲೆಗಳಿಗೆ ಸೇರಿದ್ರು ಕೂಡ ನಾವು ಪರಸ್ಪರ ಸಂವಾದವನ್ನ ಸಾಧಿಸ್ಕೋಬೇಕು. ಬಹುಶಃ ಈ ಕಾಲದ ಒಂದು ದೊಡ್ಡ ದುಸ್ಥಿತಿ ಅಥವಾ ಬಿಕ್ಕಟ್ಟು ಅಂದ್ರೆ, ಬೇರೆ ಬೇರೆ ಅಥವಾ ಯಾವುದೇ ಚಿಂತನ ಶಾಲೆಗಳಿಗೆ ಸೇರಿದ್ರು ಕೂಡ ನಾವು ಪರಸ್ಪರ ಸಂವಾದ ಮಾಡದೇ ಇರತಕ್ಕಂಥ ಸ್ಥಿತಿ. ನಾವು ಯಾರೋ ಒಬ್ರು ವಿಚಾರ ಮಂಡನೆಗೆ ಸ್ವಲ್ಪ 1% ಏನು ಹೇಳಿದ್ರು ಕೂಡ ಅವ್ರ ವಿಚಾರ ಮಂಡಿಸಿದವರು ಅದನ್ನು ಒಪ್ಪೋದಿಲ್ಲ, ಅವ್ರಿಗೆ ಇಷ್ಟ ಆಗಲ್ಲ. ಅಂತ ಸ್ಥಿತಿಯಲ್ಲಿ ನಾವಿದ್ದೀವಿ. ಬದಲು ಒಂದು ವೈಚಾರಿಕ ವಿಕಾಸಕ್ಕೆ ಅಥವಾ ಒಂದು ಜ್ಞಾನ ಮೀಮಾಂಸೆಯ ವಿಕಾಸಕ್ಕೆ ಕಾರಣ ಆಗ್ತಕ್ಕಂಥ ಸಂವಾದದ ರೀತಿಯಲ್ಲಿ ನಾವು ಸಂವಾದವನ್ನ ಮಂಡನೆಯನ್ನ ಗಟ್ಟಿಯಾಗಿ ಮಾಡಿ, ಫೈಟ್ ಮಾಡಿ, ಮತ್ತು ಮಾರನೇ ದಿವಸ ಟೀ ಕುಡಿತಕ್ಕಂತಹ ಸ್ವಭಾವವನ್ನೇ ಕಳ್ಕೊಂಡಿದೀವಿ. ಬಹುಶಃ ಇದು ಕನ್ನಡದ ಮತ್ತು ಭಾರತೀಯ ಬೌದ್ಧಿಕ ಸಂದರ್ಭದಲ್ಲಿ ಇರತಕ್ಕಂತಹ ಒಂದು ದೊಡ್ಡ ನಿರ್ವಾತವನ್ನ, ದೊಡ್ಡ ಬಿಕ್ಕಟ್ಟನ್ನ ಸೃಷ್ಟಿ ಮಾಡಿದೆ. ಕ್ಯಾಲಬ್ ಸಿಮನ್ಸ್ ಅವರನ್ನ ಯಾಕೆ ನಾನು ಈ ಸಂದರ್ಭದಲ್ಲಿ ಇದ್ ಮಾಡ್ತಿದ್ದೀನಿ ಅಂದ್ರೆ, ಕ್ಯಾಲಬ್ ಸಿಮನ್ಸ್ ಅವ್ರ ಜೊತೆ ಮೊದಲು ಮಾತಾಡಿದಾಗ ಹೇಳಿದ್ರು, ಪ್ರದೀಪ್ ನೀವು ಕುಂದಾಪುರದವರಲ್ವಾ, ನಿಮ್ಮ ಊರಿಗೆ ಬಂದಿದ್ದೆ ನಾನು. ನಿಮ್ಮ ಊರಿನಲ್ಲಿ ಈ ಚಾಮುಂಡೇಶ್ವರಿ ಮದುವೆಯನ್ನ ಸೂಚಿಸಿದ ಅದಕ್ಕೆ ಸಂಬಂಧಪಟ್ಟಂತಹ ಒಂದು ಷಷ್ಠಿ ಅಂತಕ್ಕಂಥ ನಾಗಾರಾಧನೆ ಒಂದು ಕೇಂದ್ರ ಇದೆ, ಅದಕ್ಕೆ ಬಂದಿದ್ದೆ ಅಂತೇಳಿ ಹೇಳಿದೆ. ನಂಗೆ ಆಶ್ಚರ್ಯ ಆಯ್ತು. ದೂರದ ಅಮೆರಿಕದಿಂದ, ಅರಿಜೋನಾ ಅಂತಕ್ಕಂಥ ಪ್ರದೇಶ, ಫ್ಲೋರಿಡಾದಿಂದ, ಅರಿಜೋನಾದಿಂದ ಒಬ್ಬ ಮನುಷ್ಯ ತನ್ನ ಅಧ್ಯಯನದ ಆಸಕ್ತಿಗೋಸ್ಕರ ಕುಂದಾಪುರದಂತಹ ನಮ್ಮ ಮನೆಯಿಂದ 7 ಕಿಲೋಮೀಟರ್ ದೂರದಲ್ಲಿ ಇರ್ತಕ್ಕಂತಹ ಒಂದು ಕ್ಷೇತ್ರಕ್ಕೆ ಬಂದು ವಿಸಿಟ್ ಮಾಡಿ ತನ್ನ ಅಧ್ಯಯನದ ಕಾಳಜಿಗಳನ್ನ, ಪ್ರಶ್ನೆಗಳನ್ನ, ಸಂಶೋಧನೆಯನ್ನ ಹುಡ್ಕೋ ಸ್ವಭಾವ ಇದೆಯಲ್ಲ, ಬಹುಶಃ ಅದು ತುಂಬಾ ಇಂಪಾರ್ಟೆಂಟ್. ಇದೆಲ್ಲ ನಮ್ಗೆ ಆಕ್ಚುಲಿ ಯುರೋಪ್ ಮತ್ತು ಅಮೆರಿಕಾದ ಅಧ್ಯಯನ ಮಾದರಿಗಳು ಈ ರೀತಿಯಲ್ಲಿ ನಮ್ಗೆ ತುಂಬಾ ಇಂಪಾರ್ಟೆಂಟ್ ಆದ ಮಾದರಿಗಳು. ಸೊ ಕ್ಯಾಲಬ್ ಸಿಮನ್ಸ್ ಅವರಿಗೆ ಥ್ಯಾಂಕ್ ಯು. ಕ್ಯಾಲಬ್ ಸಿಮನ್ಸ್ ಇತಿಹಾಸ ದರ್ಪಣ, ಬೆಂಗಳೂರು ಹಿಸ್ಟೋರಿಯನ್ ಸೊಸೈಟಿ ಮತ್ತು ಋತುಮಾನ, ಡಾಕ್ಟರ್ ಎಸ್ ಕೆ ಅರುಣಿ ಮತ್ತು ಹಂಗು ರಾಜೇಶ್ ಹಾಗೂ ಋತುಮಾನದ ನೇತೃತ್ವವನ್ನು ಹೊಂದಿರತಕ್ಕಂತಹ ನಿತೀಶ್ ಕುಂಟಾಡಿ ಮತ್ತು ಅವರ ತಂಡ, ಹಾಗೂ ಇಷ್ಟು ಬ್ಯೂಟಿಫುಲ್ ಆದ, ಫ್ರೂಟ್ಫುಲ್ ಆದ ಚರ್ಚೆಯನ್ನ ಮಾಡ್ಲಿಕ್ಕೆ ಕಾರಣ ಆದಂತಹ ಎಲ್ಲ ಆಡಿಯನ್ಸ್, ಎಷ್ಟು ಜನ, 100ಕ್ಕೂ ಮಿಕ್ಕಿ ಆಡಿಯನ್ಸ್ ಬಂದಿದ್ದಾರೆ. ನೀವೆಲ್ಲರೂ ಕೂಡ ತುಂಬಾ ಇಂಟೆಗ್ರಲ್ ಆಗಿ ಭಾಗವಹಿಸಿ ಈ ಚರ್ಚೆಯನ್ನ, ಸಂವಾದವನ್ನ ನಡೆಸ್ಕೊಟ್ರಿ. ಮತ್ತು ಮುಂದೆ ಕೂಡ ನಮ್ಮ ಇಂತಹ ಪ್ರೆಸೆಂಟೇಶನ್ಸ್ ತುಂಬಾ ಇದೆ. ರಿಚರ್ಡ್ ಈಟನ್ ಮಾತಾಡ್ತಾರೆ ಸೂಫಿ ಅಥವಾ ಕೃಷ್ಣದೇವರಾಯನ ಕೊನೆಯ ಯುದ್ಧದ ಮೇಲೆ, ಅಥವಾ ಕ್ಯಾಟ್ ಬಿಟ್ರಲ್ ಬ್ಯಾಂಕ್ ಅವರು ಮಾತಾಡ್ತಾರೆ. ಸೌಮ್ಯ ದೇಚಮ್ಮ ಅವ್ರು ಮಾತಾಡ್ತಾರೆ. ಹಂಪಿ ಯೂನಿವರ್ಸಿಟಿಯ TP ವಿಜಯ್ ಸರ್ ಅವ್ರು ಮಾತಾಡ್ತಾರೆ. ಅನೇಕರು ನಮ್ಮ ನಡುವಿನ ಸ್ಕಾಲರ್ಸ್ ಎಲ್ಲ ಮಾತಾಡ್ತಾರೆ. ಹೀಗೆ ಹಿರಿಯರ ನಡುವೆ ಮತ್ತು ಕಿರಿಯರ ನಡುವೆ ಒಂದು ಅವರ ವಿಚಾರವನ್ನ ಕೇಳುವ, ಪ್ರತಿಕ್ರಿಯಿಸುವ ಒಂದು ವಿಶೇಷ ಸನ್ನಿವೇಶ ಸಂದರ್ಭ ಅಷ್ಟೇ ಈ ಫೋರಂ. ದಯವಿಟ್ಟು ಮುಂದಿನ ಅಪ್ಡೇಟ್ಗಳಿಗೆ ತೆರೆದುಕೊಳ್ಳಿ. ಮತ್ತು ನಿಮ್ಮೆಲ್ಲರ ಪರವಾಗಿ ನಾನು ಕ್ಯಾಲಬ್ ಸಿಮನ್ಸ್ ಅವರಿಗೆ ತುಂಬಾ 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 ಧನ್ಯವಾದಗಳನ್ನ ಹೇಳ್ತಾ ಇದ್ದೀನಿ. ಥ್ಯಾಂಕ್ ಯು ವೆರಿ ಮಚ್ ಕ್ಯಾಲಬ್ ಸಿಮನ್ಸ್. ಧನ್ಯವಾದಗಳು.
ಥ್ಯಾಂಕ್ ಯು. ಧನ್ಯವಾದಗಳು.
ಇಲ್ಲಿಗೆ
ಯಾರಾದ್ರೂ ಮಾತಾಡಕ್ಕಿದೆಯಾ? ಅರುಣಿ ಸರ್ ಏನಿಲ್ಲಲ್ಲ?
ಅರುಣಿ ಸರ್ ನೀವು ಮತ್ತು ರಾಜೇಶ್ ಕನ್ವೆ ಮಾಡಬಹುದು.
ಸರ್ ಏನಿಲ್ಲ,
ಜಸ್ಟ್ ಕನ್ವೆ ಮಾಡಿ ಕೆಲಬ್ ಅವರಿಗೆ ನಿಮ್ಮ ಧನ್ಯವಾದ ತಿಳಿಸಬಹುದು.
ಸರ್ ಪ್ರೊಫೆಸರ್ ಕೆಲಬ್ ಸರ್, ಥ್ಯಾಂಕ್ ಯು ವೆರಿ ಮಚ್ ಫ್ರಮ್ Bengaluru Historian Society. So it's a wonderful to have you in this today's discussion. We really enjoyed your views on the Mysore Mummadi Krishnaraja Wodeyar. Thank you very much.
ಧನ್ಯವಾದಗಳು. ಥ್ಯಾಂಕ್ ಯು.
ಓಕೆ, ಥ್ಯಾಂಕ್ ಯು ವೆರಿ ಮಚ್ ಕೆಲಬ್. ಎಲ್ರಿಗೂ ಕೂಡ ಮತ್ತೆ ಪುನಃ ನಾನು ಧನ್ಯವಾದಗಳನ್ನ ಹೇಳ್ತಾ ಮುಂದಿನ ಕಾರ್ಯಕ್ರಮಕ್ಕೆ ನಮ್ ಜೊತೆ ಇರಿ ಅಂತ ಹೇಳಿ ಕೂಡ ಹೇಳ್ತಾ ಇವತ್ತಿನ ಸೆಷನ್ ಅನ್ನ ಮುಗಿಸ್ತಾ ಇದೀವಿ. ನಮಸ್ತೆ, ಬಾಯ್ ಕೆಲಬ್. ನಮಸ್ತೆ, ಬಾಯ್.
ನಮಸ್ಕಾರ.
ನಮಸ್ತೆ.